Imagine this. The smoke from the last revolutionary battle has cleared. The ink on the Treaty of Paris is dry. America is free. A new nation. A beacon of hope. For a fleeting moment, there was a sense of shared victory. A unified spirit that had defied the world's most powerful empire. But what happens when the victory parade ends and the hard work of building a nation begins? The very heroes who stood shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy now looked at each other and saw vastly different futures for the country they had just created. This wasn't just a minor disagreement over policy. It was a fundamental clash of ideologies, a battle for the very soul of America. The unity that had won the war was proving to be incredibly fragile in peace. The big question loomed over everything. What kind of nation would this be? A powerful, centralized republic with a strong federal government, or a loose confederation of sovereign states, each charting its own course? This was the moment the seeds of political division were sown, not by foreign enemies, but by the founding fathers themselves. Think about the men we revere. Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams. We often picture them as a monolithic group. The founders, all in agreement. The reality was far messier, far more passionate, and frankly, far more interesting. They were brilliant, ambitious, and deeply patriotic men. But their visions for America were on a collision course. On one side, you had figures like Alexander Hamilton, who championed a strong national government, a robust industrial economy, and a standing army. He believed this was the only way for America to command respect on the world stage and ensure its long-term survival. He looked at the chaos under the Articles of Confederation, the weak, decentralized government that preceded the Constitution and saw a nation on the brink of collapse. For Hamilton, a powerful central authority wasn't a threat to liberty. It was the only thing that could guarantee it. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson. He envisioned a completely different America. He dreamed of an agrarian republic, a nation of independent small-scale farmers, a society where liberty was preserved by limiting the power of the federal government as much as possible. Jefferson was deeply suspicious of centralized power, viewing it as the primary threat to individual freedom. He feared that Hamilton's plans for a national bank, a federal assumption of state debts, and a manufacturing-based economy would create a new kind of aristocracy, a moneyed elite that would control the government and exploit the common man. To Jefferson and his allies, like James Madison, the Hamiltonian vision looked dangerously similar to the British system they had just fought a war to escape. These weren't just abstract philosophical debates. They had real-world consequences that ignited fierce passions across the young nation. Take the debate over the national bank. Hamilton argued it was necessary and proper for managing the nation's finances, a tool to create a stable currency and foster economic growth. Jefferson and his followers were horrified. They scoured the Constitution and found no explicit mention of the federal government having the power to create a bank. They saw it as a dangerous overreach of federal authority, a slippery slope that would lead to the erosion of states' rights and individual liberties. This single issue drew a sharp line in the sand, forcing political leaders and ordinary citizens alike to choose a side. The press, still in its infancy, became the battleground for these dueling ideologies. Newspapers aligned with Hamilton's Federalists or Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, and they didn't pull any punches. They published scathing editorials, vicious personal attacks, and fiery propaganda. The founders, who we often imagine as stoic figures in portraits, were engaged in a political brawl, using anonymous essays and partisan newspapers to tear down their opponents' arguments and reputations. The language was often brutal. Jefferson was accused of being a radical, an atheist, who wanted to import the bloody chaos of the French Revolution to American shores. Hamilton was painted as a monarchist, an elitist schemer who wanted to create a new king and a new aristocracy. This political warfare shocked many, including George Washington. In his farewell address, Washington famously warned against the dangers of political factions and partisan spirit. He had seen firsthand how these divisions threatened to tear the fragile new republic apart. He pleaded with his countrymen to prioritize national unity over party loyalty. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. The fundamental disagreements over the role of government, the nature of the economy, and the meaning of liberty had created a political divide that was too deep to bridge. These weren't just two competing political parties. They were two competing visions for America's destiny. This early conflict established the fundamental tension that has defined American politics ever since: the constant push and pull between federal power and states' rights, between a focus on national unity and the protection of individual liberty, between an industrial commercial vision and an agrarian populist one. The arguments that Hamilton and Jefferson had in the 1790s are echoed in the debates we have today. Every time we argue about the size of the federal budget, the role of government in the economy, or the interpretation of the Constitution, we are continuing the conversation that began in the very first days of the Republic. So, the idyllic image of a perfectly unified post-revolutionary America is a myth. The reality is that the birth of the United States was also the birth of its political divisions. The conflict between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans was not a sign of failure, but rather the first chapter in the ongoing, often messy, and always passionate story of American democracy. Understanding this foundational conflict is the key to understanding the political landscape we live in today. It shows us that disagreement and debate are not new threats to our republic. They are woven into its very DNA. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into history as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the making of America. Last time, we explored the birth of a nation, the revolution that sparked a new world. But after the dust settled and the ink dried on the Constitution, the real work had just begun. How would this fledgling republic actually function? What would its future look like? The answers were far from clear, and the debate that would define the nation's soul was about to ignite. Championed by two intellectual giants, the founding fathers with radically different visions for America. This is the story of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Imagine walking the bustling streets of late 18th century Philadelphia, the nation's temporary capital. In one corner you have Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't born into the American aristocracy like many of his peers. An immigrant from the Caribbean, an orphan who clawed his way up through sheer force of will, intellect, and boundless ambition. Hamilton had seen the chaos of a weak government firsthand. During the war, he was a man of the city, of commerce, of finance. He looked at the vast, untamed American landscape and saw not just farms, but factories, banks, and bustling ports, connected by trade. He believed in a strong, centralized federal government, one capable of building a powerful, industrial economy that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of Europe. For Hamilton, the future of America was in its economic might, its ability to innovate and compete on a global stage. He envisioned a nation driven by industry, a meritocracy where talent and hard work, not just land ownership, were the keys to success. His America was a symphony of humming machinery, clanging hammers, and the rustle of banknotes, a dynamic, modern economic powerhouse. Now, let's journey south to the rolling hills and sprawling plantations of Virginia. Here we find our other visionary, Thomas Jefferson, a Renaissance man, a polymath, an architect, a scientist, a diplomat, and a philosopher. Unlike Hamilton, Jefferson was deeply suspicious of concentrated power. Whether in a king or a central government, he saw cities as cesspools of corruption and viewed bankers and financiers with deep distrust. For Jefferson, the heart and soul of America resided in the common man, specifically the yeoman farmer. He believed that those who worked the land, wool-weary, self-sufficient, and independent, were the true guardians of liberty. His dream was of an agrarian republic, a vast expanse of small farms where educated citizens governed themselves with minimal interference from a distant federal authority. Jefferson feared that Hamilton's vision of industry and finance would create a dependent working class, eroding the very independence he saw as essential to a healthy republic. His America was a pastoral ideal, a quiet landscape of democratic communities rooted in the soil and the principles of individual freedom. So, you have these two titans, both patriots who had risked everything for independence, now standing at a crossroads. Hamilton, the pragmatist, believed a strong national government and a robust economy were essential for survival and prosperity. Jefferson, the idealist, believed that the diffusion of power in an agrarian society were the only true safeguards of liberty. It wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies about human nature, the role of government, and the destiny of a nation. Hamilton looked at the masseuse and saw potential to be harnessed by a strong, guiding hand. Jefferson looked at the same people and saw the bedrock of democracy, to be empowered and trusted. This wasn't some abstract, academic debate. It had real-world consequences that shaped the very foundation of American policy. The first major battleground was the national debt. The Revolutionary War had left the new nation and the individual states deeply in debt. Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, proposed a radical plan. The federal government should assume all the state debts. To him, this was it would bind the states together, give creditors a stake in the success of the national government, and establish the United States' financial credibility on the world stage. It was a move to create a single, powerful economic entity. Jefferson and his allies, like James Madison, were horrified. They saw this as a massive power grab by the federal government. Virginia, for instance, had already paid off most of its war debts. Why should its citizens be taxed to pay off the debts of other, less fiscally responsible states? To them, Hamilton's plan was a scheme to enrich a small class of wealthy speculators in northern cities at the expense of the southern farmers. They saw it as the first step towards creating the kind of powerful, overbearing government they had just fought a revolution to escape. The debate was fierce, threatening to tear the young republic apart before it had even learned to walk. The deadlock was broken in one of the most famous backroom deals in American history, often called the dinner table bargain of 1790. Jefferson hosted a dinner for Hamilton and James Madison. Over a meal, a compromise was hammered out. Jefferson and Madison would whip the votes to pass Hamilton's debt assumption plan. In return, Hamilton would use his influence to move the nation's permanent capital from the northern hub of Philadelphia to a new federal district to be built on the banks of the Potomac River nestled between Virginia and Maryland. This move was symbolic and practical. It placed the seat of government in a more southern, agrarian-friendly location, appeasing Jefferson and his followers who feared the concentration of financial and political power in the North. With this compromise, Hamilton got his financial system, and Jefferson got his southern capital. It was a classic political horse trade that saved the nation from a constitutional crisis, but it also solidified the growing divide between two distinct political factions. With the debt plan secured, Hamilton moved on to his next, even more controversial proposal: the creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States. He argued that it was necessary and proper for the government to regulate currency, manage its finances, and provide credit to spur economic growth. It would be a central pillar of his industrial vision, a public-private partnership that would stabilize the nation's economy. For Jefferson, this was the ultimate betrayal of the Revolution. He scoured the Constitution and found no mention of the federal government having the power to create a bank. He was a strict constructionist, meaning he believed the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly said it could do. To him, the bank was an unconstitutional overreach of federal power, a tool that would concentrate the nation's wealth in the hands of a few elites and create a system of financial dependency, just like the one in Britain. This debate over the bank wasn't just about financial policy. It was about how to interpret the Constitution itself. Hamilton's loose constructionist view, that the government had implied powers to carry out its duties, clashed directly with Jefferson's strict interpretation. President George Washington, caught in the middle, ultimately sided with his Treasury Secretary, Hamilton, and signed the bank bill into law. This victory for Hamilton further deepened the rift between him and Jefferson, a rift that was no longer just a personal disagreement but the foundation of America's first political parties, Hamilton as Federalists and Jefferson as Democratic Republican. The visions of Hamilton and Jefferson were not just abstract political theories, they were competing blueprints for the American soul. Hamilton's Federalists championed a future of urban growth, manufacturing, and global trade, powered by a strong central government. They found their support among merchants, bankers, and city dwellers in the North. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans envisioned a decentralized republic of independent farmers, valuing states' rights and individual liberty above all. Their support was rooted in the rural South and the western frontier. These two opposing forces, born from the minds of two brilliant but starkly different men, created a dynamic tension that has defined American politics ever since. The debate over the size and scope of government, the balance between federal and state power, the conflict between agricultural and industrial interests, the argument between financial elites and the common person, all of these enduring themes in American history trace their roots back to the fundamental disagreement between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. They were rivals, certainly, and at times their animosity was personal and bitter. But they were also essential counterweights to each other. Hamilton's drive and financial acumen built the economic infrastructure that allowed the young nation to survive and grow. Jefferson's powerful defense of liberty and the common man embedded a deep-seated suspicion of concentrated power into the American psyche, creating a constant check on government overreach. One gave the nation its strong economic body, the other gave it its democratic soul. Neither man could have predicted the future, but their competing dreams created a framework, a political dialectic, that has allowed the United States to adapt, argue, and evolve for over 2 centuries. The America we live in today is the product of both men, a complex and often contradictory nation that is both Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is far from over, and the ideas of these 2 men will continue to echo through the halls of power for generations to come. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore how this political rivalry played out on the world stage. We'll see you next time. Have you ever wondered what happens asterisk after asterisk? The big celebration, after the fireworks fade and the crowds go home. For America, winning the Revolutionary War was just the beginning of an even greater challenge. Figuring out how to be a country. The victory against the British Empire was monumental, but it left the fledgling nation teetering on the edge of chaos. Imagine this. You've just thrown the biggest, most expensive party of your life, and now you're left with a massive bill, a trashed house, and all your friends are arguing about who should clean up. That's a pretty good picture of America in the 1780s. The year is 1783. The Treaty of Paris is signed, and the United States is officially recognized as an independent nation. Cheers erupt from Boston to Savannah. But beneath the celebrations, a storm was brewing. The biggest, most immediate problem was debt. Wars are incredibly expensive, and the Revolution was no exception. The Continental Congress, which had acted as the makeshift government during the war, had borrowed enormous sums of money from foreign powers like France and the Netherlands. Even more, they had borrowed from their own citizens, issuing bonds and IOUs to farmers, merchants, and soldiers who had supplied the army or fought in its ranks. The total debt was staggering, estimated to be around $79 million, a colossal amount for the time. But who was going to pay it back? This brings us to the second major problem: a weak central government. The governing document at the time was the Articles of Confederation. Now, you have to understand the mindset of the people who wrote it. They had just fought a war to escape the tyranny of a powerful, centralized government in King George III. The last thing they wanted was to create another one, so they designed the Articles to be deliberately weak. Under the Articles, the National Congress had very little power. It could declare war, make treaties, and print money, but it could not tax the states. It could only ask the states for money. And how do you think that went? It was like trying to get 30 stubborn friends to chip in for a pizza they all ate. Each state had its own interests, its own economy, and its own debts to worry about. They were reluctant to hand over their hard-earned money to a central government they didn't fully trust. Rhode Island, for example, consistently blocked attempts to give Congress the power to collect import taxes. As a result, the national government was perpetually broke. It couldn't pay its debts. It couldn't fund an army for national defense, and it couldn't even pay the interest on its loans. The nation's credit was in the gutter, and foreign countries began to wonder if this new American experiment was doomed to fail. This financial crisis created a ripple effect across the country. The economy was a mess. With no stable national currency, commerce between the states was a nightmare. New York might not accept currency from Virginia, and Massachusetts might put tariffs on goods coming in from Connecticut. It was like trying to shop in a different country every time you crossed the state line. This stifled trade and hurt farmers and merchants who relied on selling their goods across state borders. Soldiers who had been promised back pay for their service were left empty-handed. Many had received land grants as payment, But this land was often far away on the frontier and worthless without the resources to develop it. Many veterans were forced to sell their government IOUs to speculators for pennies on the dollar, just to survive. This widespread economic hardship led to growing social unrest. The most famous example of this was Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Daniel Shays was a former Continental Army captain and a farmer in western Massachusetts. Like many farmers, he was deeply in debt. The state government in Boston, dominated by wealthy merchants from the coast, started demanding that debts be paid in hard currency. Gold and silver, which was incredibly scarce. When farmers couldn't pay, their farms were seized and they were thrown into debtor's prison. This felt like a betrayal. These were men who had fought and bled for liberty, only to come home and face financial ruin at the hands of their own government. So, Daniel Shays and a group of several hundred angry farmers, many of them veterans, took matters into their own hands. They marched on courthouses, shutting them down to prevent more foreclosures. Their rebellion grew, and they even planned to raid a federal arsenal in Springfield to get more weapons. The state of Massachusetts had to raise a private militia to put down the uprising because the national government under the Articles of Confederation was powerless to intervene. Shays' rebellion sent a shockwave across the 13 states. For leaders like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, it was a terrifying wake-up call. It was proof that the Articles of Confederation were failing. The country was descending into anarchy. A weak government couldn't protect property, maintain order, or ensure the blessings of liberty they had fought so hard for. The fragility of the Union was on full display. The states were acting more like 13 separate, bickering countries than the United States. There were territorial disputes, trade wars, and a general lack of cooperation. Spain, which controlled Florida and the vast Louisiana territory, closed the Mississippi River to American trade, devastating Western farmers who needed the river to get their crops to market. On the northern frontier, the British refused to abandon their forts in the Great Lakes region, as they were supposed to under the Treaty of Paris. The weak American government could do little more than lodge formal complaints. It was clear to many that if something didn't change, the Union would dissolve. The grand experiment in self-government would end in failure, and the European powers would be there to pick up the pieces. It was this period of crisis, this critical period as historians call it, that directly led to the call for a new convention. In 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states of Rhode Island, ever the contrarian, sat this one out, gathered in Philadelphia. Their initial goal was simply to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they quickly realized it was like putting a band-aid on a broken leg. A much more radical solution was needed. They decided to scrap the Articles entirely and draft a whole new framework for government, one that would create a stronger, more effective federal system capable of dealing with the nation's immense challenges. This secret meeting would become known as the Constitutional Convention. They had learned the hard way that liberty without order is chaos. The challenge now was to create a government with enough power to be effective, but not so much power that it would become tyrannical. The future of the United States hung in the balance, and the result of their debates would shape the course of history for centuries to come. So, the next time you think about the American Revolution, remember that the end of the war wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a messy, complicated, and incredibly difficult journey. The period after the revolution was a time of profound confusion and challenge, where the very survival of the United States was in question. But it was also a period of incredible creativity and foresight, as the founders grappled with these problems and ultimately forged a new government designed to endure. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, please give us a like, share this video, and hit that subscribe button for more explorations into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time. Picture this. It's 1783. The smoke has cleared from the battlefields of the Revolution. We won. America is free, independent, and ready to take its place on the world stage. The 13 colonies, now 13 states, are united under their first ever written constitution. The Articles of Confederation. It sounds like the perfect start, right? A brand new nation built on liberty. But here's the twist. This first attempt at a government was, to put it mildly, a bit of a disaster. In fact, it was so weak, it nearly tore the brand new United States apart before it even got started. So what went wrong? Well, to understand the failure of the Articles, you have to understand the fear that created them. Americans had just fought a long, bloody war against a powerful central government, the British monarchy. They were terrified of creating another tyrant in its place, so they intentionally designed the Articles of Confederation to be weak, very weak. They created what was essentially a league of friendship between the states, not a unified nation. Under the Articles, the National Government Congress was a one-man band with no instruments. It could declare war, but it couldn't raise an army. It had to go, hat in hand, to each of the 13 states and ask for soldiers. And the states could just say no. It could print money, but so could each individual state, leading to a confusing mess of different currencies. Imagine trying to buy a coffee with Virginia dollars in New York. It was chaos. But the biggest, most fatal flaw was about money and power. The national government had no power to tax. None. Zero. It could request money from the states, but it couldn't force them to pay. Think about trying to run a country without a budget. How do you pay soldiers? How do you build roads or ships? How do you pay back the massive debts you owe to countries like France, who helped you win the war? The answer is, you can't. America was broke, and its government was powerless to fix it. Each state acted like its own little country, looking out for its own interests, often at the expense of its neighbors. They set up their own trade tariffs, arguing over borders and rivers. The United States were anything but. The situation came to a head in 1786 with something called Shays' Rebellion. In western Massachusetts, farmers, many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, were in deep trouble. They hadn't been paid for their military service, and with the economic downturn, they were falling into debt. The state government, which was also broke, started foreclosing on their farms and throwing them in debtor's prison. A former army captain named Daniel Shays had had enough. He and a group of several hundred angry farmers took up arms. They shut down courthouses to stop the foreclosures. They marched on the state arsenal. It was an armed uprising against the government. And what could the national government do about it? Absolutely nothing. It had no money and no army to send. Massachusetts had to raise its own private militia to put down the rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a terrifying wake-up call for the nation's leaders. It was like a giant, flashing neon sign that read, "Warning, government not working." George Washington himself wrote that he was mortified beyond expression. He and others, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, realized that the League of Friendship was a failure. Liberty and freedom were wonderful, but without order and a government strong enough to maintain it. The entire American experiment was doomed to collapse into chaos and anarchy. The rebellion proved that a weak central government couldn't protect its citizens, enforce its laws, or even defend itself. It couldn't manage the economy or command respect on the world stage. European powers looked at America and saw a disjointed collection of bickering states that was likely to fall apart any minute. Something had to change. And fast. This crisis, this near-total failure of the Articles of Confederation, is what directly led to the next chapter in our story. The nation's leaders knew they couldn't just tweak the Articles. They needed a complete overhaul. They needed a government with real power to tax, to raise an army, to regulate commerce, and to truly unite the states into a single, cohesive nation. So, in the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states Rhode Island, ever the rebel, sat this one out. At first gathered in Philadelphia, their initial goal was just to revise the Articles of Confederation. But they quickly realized that was like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. They needed to start from scratch. This gathering would become known as the Constitutional Convention, and what they would create in that hot, stuffy room in Philadelphia would be a radical new blueprint for a government. It was a document born directly from the failures of the Articles, a document designed to create a government strong enough to lead, but with enough checks and balances to prevent it from becoming a tyrant. They were about to forge the United States Constitution. The failure of the Articles of Confederation wasn't just a misstep. It was a crucial, necessary lesson. It taught the founding generation that, for a nation to survive, it needs more than just a shared ideal of freedom. It needs a functional, effective government capable of providing stability, security, and prosperity for its people. It set the stage for one of the most remarkable moments in political history. The creation of a government that has now endured for over 2 centuries, and that's where we'll pick up next time. Inside the locked doors of the Philadelphia Convention, where a group of brilliant, flawed, and passionate men argued, compromised, and ultimately created the framework for the nation we know today. It's a story of intense debate and ingenious design, and you won't want to miss it. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into our nation's shaky start interesting, do me a favor and hit that like button, and make sure you resubscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss the next chapter of our journey through American history. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the U.S. Constitution. Last time, we explored the compromises made during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, but getting the document written was only half the battle. Now came the real fight, getting it ratified. Imagine this, a brand new framework for a nation, but it has just a piece of paper until at least 9 of the 13 states agreed to it. This wasn't a sure thing. The country immediately split into 2 camps, the Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it. This wasn't just a political squabble. It was a clash of fundamental ideas about power, liberty, and the future of the American experiment. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, argued that a strong, centralized government was essential for the nation's survival. They believed the Articles of Confederation were a disaster, leaving the country weak, broke, and unable to command respect on the world stage. They saw the Constitution as the only way to create a stable, prosperous, and unified nation. To make their case to the public, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote a series of 85 essays, collectively known as the Federalist Papers. These were brilliant pieces of political philosophy and persuasion, published in New York newspapers. They systematically broke down the Constitution, explaining the reasoning behind each clause and defending the new structure of government. In Federalists No. 10, for example, Madison tackled the fear of factions, what we might call special interest groups or political parties today. He argued that a large republic was actually the best way to control them. In a small republic, a single faction could easily take over. But in a large one, with so many competing interests, no single group could dominate, forcing compromise and protecting the rights of the minority. Then, in Federalist No. 51, Madison explained the ingenious system of checks and balances. He famously wrote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." The idea was to divide power between the 3 executive and judicial and also between the federal government and the states. Each branch would have the power to limit the others, preventing any one part of the government from becoming too tyrannical. It was a design built on a realistic, not idealistic, view of human nature. But the Anti-Federalists had powerful arguments of their own. They weren't just a group of naysayers. They were patriots who had just fought a war against what they saw as an overbearing central government in Britain. Now, they looked at the Constitution and saw the potential for a new kind of tyranny. Prominent Anti-Federalists like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Richard Henry Lee voiced a deep-seated fear. Where was the protection for individual liberties? The proposed Constitution had no Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry, the man who had declared, "Give me liberty, or give me death," thundered against the Constitution in the Virginia ratifying convention. He feared the presidency would become a monarchy, and that the federal government would swallow up the state's power entirely. The Anti-Federalists worried that a distant, powerful government would be out of touch with the needs of ordinary people. They championed the small, local republic, where representatives were close to their constituents and truly understood their lives. They published their own essays under pseudonyms like Brutus and Cato, arguing that the Constitution's necessary and proper clause and its supremacy clause would give the federal government unlimited power. The ratification debates were intense, happening in state conventions, town squares, and taverns across the country. Delaware was the first to ratify, unanimously, in December 1787. But the real battles were in the large, influential states, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. In the convention, was deadlocked. Many delegates, including former rebels from Shays' Rebellion, were deeply suspicious of the new government. A compromise was eventually reached, known as the Massachusetts Compromise. The delegates agreed to ratify the Constitution, but they strongly recommended that a series of amendments protecting individual rights be added immediately. This set a crucial precedent. The promise of a Bill of Rights became the key to winning over the skeptics. When the debate moved to Virginia, the intellectual heavyweight of the states, the arguments were fierce. On one side stood James Madison, defending his work. On the other, Patrick Henry and George Mason, who refused to even sign the Constitution in Philadelphia because it lacked a Bill of Rights. In the end, Virginia narrowly voted to ratify, but like Massachusetts, they insisted on the addition of amendments. The final, nail-biting showdown was in New York. The anti-Federalists had a clear majority in the ratifying convention. Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant and tireless advocate, led the Federalist charge. News that New Hampshire had become the 9th state to ratify officially putting the Constitution into effect put immense pressure on New York. The state now faced the prospect of being an independent nation sandwiched between two parts of the new United States. After a long and bitter debate, New York ratified by a razor-thin margin of just 3 votes. The Federalist Papers had done their job. So, the Constitution was ratified. The Federalists had won the battle, but the Anti-Federalists had won the war for individual liberties. Their persistent, passionate demand for a Bill of Rights led directly to the creation of the first 10 amendments. These amendments, which we'll discuss in our next chapter, protect our most fundamental freedoms: freedom of speech, religion, the press, and the right to a fair trial. The ratification debate wasn't just a historical event. It was the first great national conversation about what America should be. It revealed a fundamental tension that still exists today: the balance between a strong, effective national government and the protection of individual and state rights. This debate shaped the nation and ensured that the new framework of government began with a solemn promise to protect the liberties of its citizens. Thank you so much for watching. This period is so vital to understanding the country we live in today. If you found this helpful, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter on the Bill of Rights. We'll see you then. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment, a time when the very soul of the new nation was being forged. We're talking about the rise of the Federalists and the ambitious and often controversial vision of one of America's most brilliant and divisive figures, Alexander Hamilton. So, the Revolutionary War is won, the Constitution is ratified, but the United States is far from a powerhouse. It's more like a wobbly toddler, deeply in debt, with a patchwork economy and a weak central government. The states are acting like squabbling siblings, each looking out for their own interests. The big question on everyone's mind was, what kind of nation are we going to be? And on this stage steps Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton wasn't born into the Virginia planter aristocracy like Jefferson or Washington. He was an immigrant from the Caribbean, a self-made man who had clawed his way up through sheer intellect and relentless ambition. He'd seen chaos and instability, and he believed the only way for America to survive and thrive was with a powerful, energetic national government. His vision wasn't of a quiet, agrarian republic of small farmers. No, Hamilton saw a future America that was a bustling, industrial, and commercial powerhouse, a nation that could compete on the world stage with the great empires of Europe. He proposed a radical, 3-part financial plan that would fundamentally reshape the country. First, and most controversially, was the assumption of state debts. After the war, both the national government and the individual states were buried in debt. Hamilton argued that the federal government should take on, or assume, all that debt. Why? Well, it was a brilliant power play. Bidoin, tis, the nation's creditors, the wealthy merchants and financiers who had loaned money for the war, would now have a direct stake in the success of the asterisk. That government, not just the individual states. If the U.S. government succeeded, they got their money back. It was a way to bind the economic elite to the federal government, creating a powerful class of allies. Of course, this caused an uproar. States like Virginia, which had already paid off most of their debts, were furious. Why should they be taxed to pay off the debts of less responsible states like Massachusetts? It seemed deeply unfair. This is where we see the first major political battle lines being drawn, pitting Hamilton against figures like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who feared this move would concentrate too much power in the federal government and penalize fiscally responsible states. The debate was so fierce it nearly tore the young government apart. The deadlock was famously broken in what is known as the Compromise of 1790. Over a private dinner, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison hammered out a deal. Jefferson and Madison would whip the votes in Congress to pass Hamilton's debt assumption plan. In return, Hamilton would use his influence to move the nation's capital from the northern hub of Philadelphia to a new federal district to be built on the Potomac River, right between Virginia and Maryland. This gave the southern states more influence over the seat of government and was a huge political win for them. Thus, Washington, D.C. was born out of this grand political bargain. With the debt plan secured, Hamilton moved to his second major proposal, the creation of a national bank. This wasn't just a place to store government money. Modeled on the Bank of England, the Bank of the United States would be a public-private partnership. It would issue a stable national currency, regulate state banks, and provide loans to businesses to spur economic growth. For Hamilton, this was the engine that would power his vision of an industrial America. It would create a reliable financial system, something the country desperately lacked. But again, Jefferson and his allies were horrified. They looked at the Constitution and saw no mention of the federal government having the power to create a bank. They were strict constructionists, believing the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly said it could do. Granting it this implied power, they argued, was a slippery slope to tyranny. It would create a financial monster that would benefit northern bankers and merchants at the expense of southern farmers. Hamilton fired back with a powerful argument for broad construction. He pointed to the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. Hamilton argued that since Congress had the power to tax, regular commerce, and pay debts, a national bank was a necessary and proper tool to achieve those ends. It wasn't about absolute necessity, he said, but about what was useful and convenient. President Washington, after much deliberation, was persuaded by Hamilton's logic and signed the bill, creating the first Bank of the United States in 1791. This debate over a constitutional interpretation, strict versus broad, has remained a central theme in American politics ever since. Finally, Hamilton's third pillar was his report on manufactures. Here, he laid out his full vision for America's economic future. He argued that the nation shouldn't rely solely on agriculture. To be truly independent and powerful, it needed to develop its own manufacturing base. To do this, he proposed a system of protective tariff taxes on imported goods. These tariffs would make foreign products more expensive, encouraging Americans to buy domestically produced goods. The revenue from these tariffs could then be used to fund bounties, or subsidies, to support new and emerging American industries. This was a direct challenge to the Jeffersonian ideal of a nation of yeoman farmers. Jefferson feared that industrialization and the growth of cities would create a dependent working class, similar to what he saw in Europe, which he believed was corrupt and destructive to Republican virtue. He wanted America to remain a land of independent, self-sufficient landowners. The fight was on for the soul of America. Would it be Hamilton's industrial, urban nation, or Jefferson's agrarian republic? While Congress was hesitant to fully embrace his industrial plan at the time, Hamilton's ideas laid the groundwork for America's economic policy for much of the 19th century. Together, these policies, the assumption of debt, the national bank, and the push for industry formed the core of the Federalist platform. They believed in a strong, centralized government, a dynamic commercial economy led by a financial elite, and a foreign policy that leaned towards Britain, our biggest trading partner. Those who opposed this vision, led by Jefferson and Madison, began to organize. They called themselves Democratic Republicans, and they championed states' rights, an agrarian economy, and a foreign policy that was more sympathetic to revolutionary France. And so, the first American political party system was born, not from a grand design, but from the fiery debates over Alexander Hamilton's audacious vision for the nation. He didn't just want to fix the country's finances. He wanted to build a new kind of nation, a powerful, modern state capable of standing among the giants of the world. Whether you see him as a hero who secured America's future or a schemer who favored the rich and powerful, there's no denying that Alexander Hamilton's vision profoundly shaped the United States we live in today. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think of Hamilton's plan? Was he a visionary, or was he setting the country on a dangerous path? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving deep into the mind of one of America's most complex and influential founders, Thomas Jefferson. We're going to explore a vision that was at the very core of his political philosophy. The dream of an agrarian republic. What did that mean? Why was he so passionate about it? And how does that vision echo or clash with the America we live in today? So, picture this. It's the late 18th century. The United States is a brand new nation, a fragile experiment. While figures like Alexander Hamilton were envisioning a future of bustling cities, powerful banks, and a strong industrial base, Jefferson was looking in the opposite direction. He looked out at the vast, rolling landscapes of America and saw not just land, but the very foundation of freedom. For Jefferson, the ideal citizen wasn't a banker, a merchant, or a factory worker. It was the yeoman farmer, the person who owned their own plot of land, worked it with their own hands, and depended on no one but themselves and the seasons for their livelihood. Why was this so important to him? Because he believed that economic independence was the bedrock of political independence. Think about it from his perspective. If your livelihood depends on a wealthy employer, or a powerful bank, or a distant government contract, are you truly free to speak your mind? Can you vote your conscience without fear of reprisal? Jefferson was deeply suspicious of these relationships of dependency. He saw cities as potential cesspools of corruption, where people were crowded together, reliant on wage labor, anonymously swayed by mobs or manipulated by the wealthy elite. He famously wrote, "I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they are chiefly agricultural." The farmer, in his eyes, was different. Owning land gave them a tangible stake in society. It fostered virtues he prized: hard work, self-reliance, honesty, and a connection to the natural world. These weren't just abstract ideals. He believed they were the essential ingredients for a functioning republic. A nation of independent farmers, he argued, would be a nation of independent thinkers who could participate in government with clear eyes and a pure heart, uncorrupted by the complexities and temptations of a commercial society. This vision directly fueled his political agenda. It's why he was a champion of a small, limited federal government. A big, powerful central government, with its taxes, regulations, and standing armies, was a threat to the liberty of the individual farmer. He believed power should be kept as local as possible, close to the people it governed. The federal government's role was simply to handle foreign affairs and ensure a common defense, not to meddle in the daily lives and economic affairs of its citizens. This philosophy was at the heart of the great debate of his era, the clash with Hamilton's Federalists. Hamilton saw a future powered by finance, manufacturing, and a strong central government to promote them. Jefferson saw that as a path to the very same European-style corruption and aristocracy that they had just fought a revolution to escape. For him, a national bank wasn't a tool for economic growth. It was an engine of speculation and a way for a financial elite to gain power over the common person. One of the most significant actions driven by this agrarian dream was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. It might seem like a contradiction. A president who believed in small government making a massive executive decision to double the size of the country. But for Jefferson, it was perfectly logical. He called it creating an empire of liberty. That vast new territory wasn't for building industrial empires. It was to ensure that for generations to come, there would be enough land for every American to have their own farm. It was a move to perpetuate his agrarian ideal, to push the horizon of his yeoman republic further and further west. However, Jefferson's dream had a profound and tragic contradiction at its very core. This empire of liberty was built on land taken from Native Americans, and the economic engine of much of this agrarian society. especially in the South, was the labor of enslaved people. Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, was a lifelong enslaver. He extolled the virtue of the independent farmer while his own idyllic life at Monticello was made possible by the forced labor of hundreds of individuals who had no liberty or land of their own. This is the great, uncomfortable paradox of Jefferson's vision. He championed the liberty of the white yeoman farmer while simultaneously denying it to others. His dream of an independent, rural republic was inseparable from the realities of dispossession and slavery. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish the power of his ideal, but it forces us to see it in its full, complicated context. So, as America grew, which path did it follow? In the short term, Jefferson's vision seemed to flourish. The 19th century was a period of immense westward expansion, with land being the primary driver of the nation's growth. But Hamilton's vision was quietly gaining ground. The Industrial Revolution took hold, cities grew exponentially, and by the end of the century, the forces of finance, industry, and urban life had become dominant. Today, we live in a world that looks much more like Hamilton's vision than Jefferson's. Less than 2% of Americans are now farmers. We are a nation of cities and suburbs, of global commerce and complex financial systems. The very dependencies that Jefferson feared reliance on employers, on global supply chains, on a powerful federal government are now fundamental features of our lives. And yet, Jefferson's dream hasn't entirely disappeared. It persists in our culture. It rests there in the romantic ideal of getting away from it all and living a simpler life. It's in the political rhetoric that praises small-town values and distrusts centralized power. It rests in the enduring American belief in self-reliance and the ideal of owning your own little piece of the world. Jefferson's agrarian republic may never have been fully realized, and it was founded on deep, troubling contradictions. But his core belief that the health of a republic depends on the independence and virtue of its citizens remains a powerful and relevant question for us to consider. What does it mean to be an independent citizen in the 21st century? And how do we cultivate the virtues necessary for self-government in a world so different from the one Jefferson envisioned? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Jefferson's dream. It is a topic that reveals so much about where America came from and the debates that continue to shape it today. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so please drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Into grand, intricate tapestry of our universe. From the silent dance of distant galaxies to the bustling symphony of life within a single cell, there exists a profound and often unseen force. It's a principle so fundamental that it governs every interaction, every change, every moment of existence. We might call it by many names: equilibrium, harmony, justice, or karma. But today, let's explore it under a single, encompassing title: the Great Balancer. This isn't a deity or a conscious entity, but rather an inherent property of reality itself, a cosmic law that ensures, over the vast expanse of time, that every action finds its equal and opposite reaction. It is the universe's natural tendency toward equilibrium, a relentless push and pull that maintains order amidst apparent chaos. Imagine a perfectly still pond. Its surface is a mirror, reflecting the sky with flawless clarity. When you toss a pebble into it, ripples spread outward, disrupting the tranquility. But what happens next? The water doesn't remain in a state of turmoil forever. Gradually, the ripples lose energy, the surface calms, and the pond returns to its state of serene stillness. The energy you introduced has been absorbed and dissipated, and balance is restored. The Great Balancer is like the very nature of that water, always seeking to return to a state of peace. It's the force that pulls a pendulum back to its center, the process that turns a raging forest fire into fertile ground for new growth, and the silent hand that guides evolution not through brute force alone but through adaptation and harmony with the environment. This principle operates on every scale. In physics, we see it in Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. It is the reason rockets can launch into space, and why Udanti fall through the floor. The forces are in balance. In chemistry, reactions seek equilibrium, a state where the forward and reverse processes occur at the same rate, creating a stable, balanced system. Ecosystems, too, are a testament to this law. A boom in the rabbit population leads to an increase in their predators, the foxes. As the foxes thrive, they reduce the rabbit population, which in turn leads to a decline in the fox population due to food scarcity. It's a continuous, self-correcting cycle, a delicate dance of predator and prey, life and death, all orchestrated by the invisible hand of the great balancer. But perhaps its most profound and personal application is within our own lives. In the realm of human experience, we often speak of karma, the idea that our actions, both good and bad, will eventually return to us. While this is often seen through a mystical or religious lens, it can also be understood as a natural, psychological, and social manifestation of the great balancer. When we act with kindness, empathy, and generosity, we are, in essence, sending out positive ripples into the world. These actions build trust, foster strong relationships, and create a supportive social network. The goodwill we extend often returns to us, not through some magical intervention, but because we have cultivated an environment of positivity around ourselves. People are more likely to help someone who has helped them, to trust someone who has been honest, and to love someone who has shown love. The balance is restored through the natural consequences of our own behavior. Conversely, actions rooted in selfishness, deceit, or harm create their own kind of ripples. A person who constantly takes advantage of others may achieve short-term gains, but they simultaneously erode trust and create resentment. Over time, they may find themselves isolated, their bridges burned, their reputation tarnished. The world, in a sense, balances the scales. The negativity they put out is reflected back in the form of loneliness, suspicion, and a lack of genuine connection. It's not a punishment from the cosmos, but a direct, logical outcome. You cannot sow seeds of discord and expect to harvest a garden of peace. The great balancer ensures that the energy we project into the world ultimately shapes the world we experience. This concept extends beyond individual actions to societal structures. History is filled with examples of empires built on oppression and inequality that eventually crumbled under their own weight. The imbalance of power, the exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few, creates a tension, a societal debt that must eventually be paid. Revolutions, reforms, and social movements can be seen as the collective effort of humanity to restore balance, to correct an injustice that has grown too large to sustain. The arc of the moral universe is long, as Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, but it bends toward justice. It bends toward balance. The great balancer works through the collective conscience, through the tireless efforts of those who fight for fairness and equality, slowly but surely pulling society back toward a more equitable equilibrium. Understanding the principle of the great balancer offers us a powerful framework for living a more intentional and harmonious life. It encourages us to be mindful of the ripples we create with every thought, word, and deed. It's a call to take responsibility for the energy we bring into every situation. Are we a source of calm or a source of chaos? Are we building bridges or erecting walls? Are we contributing to balance or fostering imbalance? This doesn't mean we must be perfect. Like the tossed pebble, our actions will inevitably create disturbances. The key is to act with awareness and integrity, trusting that the universe's inherent tendency is toward healing and restoration. When we face challenges or injustices, it can be comforting to remember this principle. It doesn't mean we should be passive and simply wait for the universe to fix things. On the contrary, it empowers us to become agents of balance. When we see a wrong, we can work to make it right. When we encounter suffering, we can offer compassion. We become active participants in this cosmic dance, aligning ourselves with the fundamental flow of the universe toward harmony. Doing so, we not only contribute to the well-being of the whole, but also find a deeper sense of peace and purpose within ourselves. We find our own center of gravity in a world that is constantly in motion. We learn to trust the process, to have faith that even after the most violent storms, the waters will eventually calm, and the sun will shine once more upon a world restored to balance. The great balancer is not a judge, but a teacher. It doesn't punish, it corrects. It is the silent, unwavering law that holds everything together, reminding us that we are all part of a single, interconnected system. Every choice we make matters. Every act of kindness sends a healing ripple. Every effort toward justice helps bend the arc. By living in alignment with this profound universal truth, we contribute to the harmony of the cosmos, and in doing so, find our own lasting peace. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration today. If this idea resonated with you, I'd be so grateful if you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. It really helps us continue these conversations. Until next time, be well and be a force for balance in the world. Welcome, bike history buffs, to our deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in our nation's story. We're in Chapter 9, and the air is thick with tension. Imagine a world without instant messages or social media, where the most powerful weapons were the written and spoken word. This was the reality for the architects of our country, and boy, did they know how to use them. Letters, pamphlets, and speeches flew between them like arrows. This wasn't just friendly debate. This was a war of ideas fought on paper and in public squares. Each word was carefully chosen, each argument sharpened to a razor's edge. Think of it like an epic rap battle, but instead of beats, you have brilliant minds clashing. And instead of a microphone, you have a quill pen scratching furiously by candlelight. These weren't just dusty old documents. They were declarations. They were pleas. They were attacks. They were shaping the very soul of a new nation, one powerful sentence at a time. Let's break down the main players in this intellectual battlefield. On one side, you had the Federalists, championed by titans like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Their vision was one of a strong, centralized government. They argued, through powerful essays and persuasive speeches, that a robust federal authority was essential for national unity, economic stability, and international respect. They believed that without it, the fragile new union would fracture into 13 bickering states, unable to defend themselves or prosper. Their writings, like the famed Federalist Papers, were masterpieces of political theory, designed to convince a skeptical public that their future lay in a stronger, more cohesive nation. They painted a picture of order, progress, and power on the world stage. On the other side stood the a passionate and diverse group led by figures like Patrick Henry and George Mason. They were wary of centralized power, seeing in it the ghost of the British monarchy they had just fought to escape. Their arrows fiery speeches and widely circulated pamphlets warned of tyranny and the erosion of individual liberties. They championed the rights of the common person and the sovereignty of the states. They asked tough questions. Who would protect the farmer in Virginia from a distant, powerful government in a far-off capital? Where was the guarantee of their fundamental freedoms? Their arguments resonated deeply with a populace that had sacrificed everything for the principle of self-governance. They were the voice of caution, the guardians of the revolutionary spirit. The sheer volume of this exchange is staggering. Imagine printing presses, running day and night, churning out pamphlets that were eagerly passed from hand to hand in taverns and town squares. Picture couriers on horseback, galloping across muddy roads to deliver letters that could alter the course of a debate. Speeches in state houses could last for hours, holding audiences captivated as speakers laid out their visions for the future. This wasn't a conversation happening behind closed doors. It was a nationwide dialogue. Every literate citizen had the opportunity to read the arguments, to weigh the evidence, and to form their own opinion. It was a testament to the belief that a republic's strength lies in an informed and engaged citizenry. The fate of the Constitution, and indeed the country, hung in the balance, swaying with the power of each argument. One of the most fascinating aspects of this war of words was the use of pseudonyms. Writers on both sides often published their work under Roman-sounding names, like Publius for the Federalists, or Brutus and Cato for the Anti-Federalists. This wasn't just about hiding their identity. It was a clever rhetorical strategy. By invoking these figures from the Roman Republic, they were tapping into a shared classical education and signaling their own civic virtue. It elevated the debate, suggesting that this was not a petty squabble but a profound discussion about the very nature of liberty and governance, echoing the great debates of ancient history. It allowed the arguments to be judged on their own merit, rather than on the reputation of the author. The intensity of this period cannot be overstated. Friendships were strained, and political rivalries were forged in the heat of this intellectual combat. Take James Madison and Patrick Henry in Virginia. They were colleagues, fellow revolutionaries, yet they found themselves on opposite sides of this great divide. Their debates were legendary, a clash of intellectual brilliance and powerful oratory. Madison, the careful, logical architect of the Constitution, methodically built his case for ratification. Henry, the passionate voice of the Revolution, thundered against it, warning that it would spell the end of liberty. The stakes were personal, but they were also monumental. The decision each state made would have consequences for generations to come. So what can we learn from this incredible exchange? It shows us that democracy is not a spectator sport. It is an active, ongoing conversation. The founders didn't just create a system of government. They engaged in a vigorous, and sometimes vicious, debate about what that government should be. They understood that the power of a well-reasoned argument and the free exchange of ideas were the lifeblood of a healthy republic. Their letters, pamphlets, and speeches weren't just arrows. They were the building blocks of a nation, carefully placed, hotly contested, and ultimately forming the foundation of the country we live in today. It's a powerful reminder that our own words and our participation in the discussions of our time matter. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Chapter 9. It's a truly epic story of intellectual warfare, and we've only scratched the surface. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. Drop a comment below and let me know which argument, Federalist or Anti-Federalist, you find more persuasive. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving deep into a pivotal moment. The birth of the nation's first political party, the Federalists. This isn't just a story about politics. It's a story about a clash of visions for America's future. A debate that still echoes today. So, picture this. The ink on the Constitution is barely dry. The new nation is fragile, burdened by debt, and struggling to find its footing on the world stage. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and ambitious Secretary of the Treasury. He had a bold plan to transform the United States from a loose confederation of agricultural states into a powerful, unified commercial empire. But a plan this radical was bound to create opposition, and in doing so, it forged an entirely new political force. At the heart of Hamilton's vision was his financial system. First, he proposed that the federal government assume the massive debts incurred by the individual states during the Revolutionary War. This was a controversial move. States that had already paid off their debts, like Virginia, felt it was unfair. But Hamilton had a bigger goal. By consolidating the debt, he would bind the nation's wealthy creditors to the success of the federal government. If the national government failed, they would lose their money. It was a clever way to create a powerful class of stakeholders invested in national stability. This created a national debt, which, far from being a weakness, Hamilton saw as a national blessing, a tool to establish the country as credit and unite its people under a single economic destiny. Next came the creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States, modeled on the Bank of England. This institution would serve as the government's financial agent, holding its deposits, issuing a stable paper currency, and providing loans to spur economic growth. This was revolutionary. At the time, the country was flooded with different state and private currencies, creating chaos for trade. A single, reliable currency would be the lifeblood of a national economy. Opponents, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, were horrified. They argued that the Constitution didn't explicitly grant Congress the power to create a bank. This was the first major test of constitutional interpretation. Hamilton countered with a doctrine of implied powers, arguing that the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution gave the government the authority to do what was needed to carry out its duties. President Washington sided with Hamilton, and the bank was born. The final piece of Hamilton's economic puzzle was his report on manufactures. He called for tariff taxes on imported goods to protect America's infant industries from foreign competition. He also advocated for government subsidies, or bounties, to encourage new manufacturing ventures. He envisioned a future where America was not just a land of farmers, but a bustling hub of factories and innovation. A nation that could produce its own goods and stand on its own 2 feet economically. This was a direct challenge to the agrarian ideal held by Jefferson, who believed that the strength of the republic lay in its independent yeoman farmers. So, who were the people rallying behind Hamilton's audacious vision? They weren't your average farmers. They were the merchants of New England and the port cities, the bankers of Philadelphia and New York, the lawyers, urban artisans, and speculators who saw their own prosperity tied to a strong, centralized economy. They were the people who dealt with contracts, shipping, and international trade. They craved order, stability, and a government powerful enough to protect their property and enforce agreements. They had witnessed the chaos of the Articles of Confederation and feared that too much liberty could lead to anarchy. For them, a strong national government wasn't a threat to freedom. It was its ultimate guarantor. These individuals began to coalesce, first informally, then as a more organized group. They called themselves Federalists, hearkening back to their support for the ratification of the Constitution. They believed in leadership by the wise and the good, the educated, experienced, and wealthy elite. They weren't anti-democratic in principle, but they were deeply skeptical of mob rule and believed that the public's passions needed to be filtered through the wisdom of their social superiors. Their worldview was pragmatic, commercial, and distinctly forward-looking, but also deeply rooted in an older, more hierarchical view of society. They saw America's future aligned with Great Britain, the world's leading commercial power, and favored policies that would strengthen those ties. The birth of the Federalist Party wasn't a planned event with a specific date. It grew organically out of the intense legislative battles of the early 1790s. Every time Hamilton proposed a new part of his financial plan, he forced members of Congress to choose a side. Were they for a strong, centralized government with a dynamic commercial economy, or did they favor a more limited, agrarian republic where power remained with the states? This fundamental disagreement was the crucible in which the Federalist Party was forged. It was a party of order, of national ambition, and of capital. But in creating this powerful faction, Hamilton inadvertently created its opposite. The resistance led by Jefferson and Madison would soon organize into the Democratic-Republican Party, setting the stage for the first great political rivalry in American history. The Federalists may have won the initial battles, shaping the economic foundations of the nation in ways that are still felt today, but their vision would be fiercely contested for decades to come. Their story is a powerful reminder that from the very beginning, America has been defined by the struggle between competing ideas about its soul and its destiny. Thank you so much for watching. We've only scratched the surface of this fascinating topic. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll explore the rise of the opposition. We'll see you next time. Imagine America in its infancy, a brand new nation trying to figure itself out. Tensions are high, and 2 very different visions for the country are about to clash. On one side, you have the Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton. They're thinking big, a strong central government, a bustling economy driven by banking and industry, and close ties with their old colonial ruler, Britain. They see this as the path to a powerful, respected nation on the world stage. But not everyone is on board with this plan. Step into the shoes of Thomas Jefferson and his close ally, James Madison. They look at Hamilton's vision and see a threat to liberty, a threat to the common man, and a dangerous echo of the very monarchy they had just fought a revolution to escape. They see a government getting too big, too powerful, and too cozy with the wealthy elite in the cities. So, what do? They don't just sit back and complain, they organize they rally. They form a new political party, a force to counter the Federalists. They call themselves the Democratic Republic. This isn't just a name. It's a declaration of their core beliefs. Democratic for the power of the people, and Republican for a government of representatives, not a king. Their vision for America is a stark contrast to the Federalists. Instead of bustling cities and big banks, they champion the cause of the independent farmer, the hardy frontier settler, and the everyday artisan, the backbone of the nation. They believe that true American virtue is found not in a stock exchange, but in the soil, tilled by free men. These are the people, they argue, who are truly invested in the country's success, the ones with a real stake in the land. The Democratic Republicans preach a gospel of small government. They believe power should be kept as close to the people as possible. Think local. Think state level. A powerful federal government, hundreds of miles away, felt distant and dangerous to them. They argued it would inevitably become corrupt, cater to special interests, and trample on individual freedoms. Their mantra is simple: a government that governs least governs best. Keep it simply, keep it limited, and let people run their own lives. And then there's the issue of foreign policy, a major flashpoint. While the Federalists, with their commercial interests, looked to Britain as a model of stability and a valuable trading partner, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans looked elsewhere. Their hearts were with revolutionary France. They saw the French Revolution, despite its chaos and violence, as a sister movement to their own, another chapter in the global struggle for liberty, equality, and fraternity against the tyranny of monarchy. This created a deep, passionate divide. Were you pro-British or pro-French? It was a question that defined your political identity. For the Democratic Republicans, siding with France was a moral imperative. It was about standing with a fellow republic against the old, corrupt monarchies of Europe. To them, the Federalists' affinity for Britain was a betrayal of the American revolutionary spirit. So you have these two titans clashing, Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic. It's not just a polite disagreement. It's a battle for the very soul of America. One side envisions a powerful, centralized, industrial nation, respected and feared on the world stage. The other imagines a sprawling, agrarian republic of independent citizens, free from the grasp of a powerful central authority and the corrupting influence of big money. This conflict between these first two political parties set the stage for the debates that would shape American history for centuries to come. The arguments over the size of government, the rights of the individual versus the power of the state, and America's role in the world. They all started right here in this fiery clash of ideals between the Federalists and the Democratic Republic. This was more than just politics. It was the forging of a nation's identity in the crucible of debate. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this chapter of American history as fascinating as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Scene opens on a visual of a bustling late 18th century American street, with newsboys shouting and waving newspapers. Hello and welcome back to our series. We've reached a pivotal moment in our story, a time when the battlefield shifted from open fields and smoky cannons to the printed page. This is Chapter 12, The Battle of Newspapers. Imagine this. The year is 1792. The ink is barely dry on the Constitution, and the new American Republic is still finding its footing. The revolutionary unity that won independence is starting to fray, replaced by something entirely new and too many terrifying political parties. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, with Thomas Jefferson at their helm, weren't just political opponents. They were ideological warriors, each convinced that the other's vision would lead the nation to ruin. But how do you fight a war of ideas? How do you rally a nation to your side when your opponent is your neighbor, your friend, even your family member? You take the fight to the press, and that's exactly what they did. This wasn't the objective journalism we think of today. Oh, no. This was a bare-knuckle brawl fought with ink and paper. Newspapers like John Finau's Gazette of the United States became the mouthpiece for the Federalists, championing a strong central government, a robust financial system, and close ties with Britain. Finau painted Hamilton as a visionary architect of national prosperity. His pages were filled with essays, reports, and editorials that praised the administration's every move, framing their policies as the only path to stability and international respect. If you read the Gazette, you'd believe that anyone opposing Hamilton was a chaotic, dangerous radical, eager to drag America back into the anarchy of the pre-Constitution days. On the other side of the street, you had Philip Freneau's National Gazette. Backed by Jefferson and James Madison, this paper was the heart and soul of the Republican opposition. Freneau was a master of satire and a fiery writer. He depicted the Federalists not as nation builders, but as would-be monarchs, secretly plotting to establish an American aristocracy. His paper decried Hamilton's financial plans as a scheme to enrich a wealthy elite at the expense of the common farmer and artisan. Through scathing poems, pointed essays, and reprinted letters from the countryside, the National Gazette championed states' rights, agrarian values, and the spirit of the French Revolution. Painting Jefferson as the true defender of liberty, suddenly, the streets of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston were flooded with these fiercely partisan papers. Newsboys on every corner weren't just selling news. They were selling a worldview. And people were buying in, literally and figuratively. These weren't just dry political treatment. They were sensational, scandalous, and deeply personal. Think of it as the 18th century version of viral content. Rumors spread like wildfire. One day, a Federalist paper might print a story hinting at Jefferson's supposed atheism or his radical sympathies for the most extreme elements of the French Revolution. The next day, a Republican paper would retaliate with a vicious caricature of President Washington as a king, or accuse Hamilton of corruption and personal indiscretion. The attacks were relentless. They used pseudonyms to launch their most vicious assaults. Hamilton, writing as Catullus, would trade blows with Jefferson's allies. They dug into each other's pasts, questioned each other's patriotism, and twisted each other's words into unrecognizable shapes. The goal wasn't to inform. It was to persuade, to enrage, and to mobilize. They were creating political identities, forcing citizens to pick a team. And this battle of words spilled out of the coffeehouses and government halls and into every corner of American life. Families were divided over the dinner table. One brother, a merchant who benefited from Hamilton's economic policies, would argue fiercely with another, a farmer who felt crushed by federal taxes. Friendships that had been forged in the fires of the Revolution were strained, sometimes to the breaking point. Even the taverns, those quintessential public squares of early America, became ideological battlegrounds. A toast to President Washington might be met with cheers in one tavern and grumbles in another, depending on whether the patrons saw him as a unifying national hero or a pawn of the Federalist elite. The newspaper you read signaled your allegiance. It was a badge of identity. Clergymen used their pulpits to weigh in, quoting scripture to support either the Federalist cause of order and authority or the Republican cause of liberty and individual virtue. The very soul of the nation was up for grabs, and every citizen was being asked to choose a side. This was a terrifying development for the founding generation. They had designed a republic, a government based on reasoned debate and the common good. They feared faction, what we would call partisanship, believing it was a poison that could destroy everything they had built. George Washington himself warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party in his farewell address. He saw this division as a mortal threat to the young nation. Yet, in a way, this media war was also a sign of a vibrant, if chaotic, democracy in action. For the first time, political debate wasn't just for the wealthy and educated elite in Philadelphia. It was for everyone. A farmer in rural Virginia, a blacksmith in Massachusetts, a shopkeeper in Charleston, they were all being brought into the national conversation. They were reading, arguing, and forming opinions about the direction of their country. The literacy rate was surprisingly high, and for those who couldn't read, the papers were read aloud in taverns, workshops, and public squares. This explosion of political print democratized information and mobilized a national electorate in a way that had never been seen before. It was messy, it was ugly, and it was often based on lies and slander. But it was also the process by which Americans learned to be citizens of a divided republic. They were learning to disagree, fiercely and fundamentally, without resorting to violence. The Battle of the Newspapers defined the 1790s. It set the stage for the crucial election of 1800, one of the most bitter and contested in American history. The lines drawn by Fino and Freno, by Hamilton and Jefferson, would harden over time, shaping the American political landscape for decades to come. The country was divided, not by armies or oceans, but by ideas, spread on cheap paper and carried on the winds of political passion. The great American experiment in self-government had entered a new, uncertain, and incredibly noisy chapter. Thanks for watching. This period really shows how media has always played a powerful role in shaping our society. doesn't it? If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you and miss the next chapter in our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Scene opens on a visual of a bustling late 18th century American street, with newsboys shouting and waving newspapers. Hello and welcome back to our series. We've reached a pivotal moment in our story, a time when the battlefield shifted from open fields and smoky cannons to the printed page. This is Chapter 12, The Battle of Newspapers. Imagine this. The year is 1792. The ink is barely dry on the Constitution, and the new American Republic is still finding its footing. The revolutionary unity that won independence is starting to fray, replaced by something entirely new and too many terrifying political parties. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, with Thomas Jefferson at their helm, weren't just political opponents. They were ideological warriors, each convinced that the other's vision would lead the nation to ruin. But how do you fight a war of ideas? How do you rally a nation to your side when your opponent is your neighbor, your friend, even your family member? You take the fight to the press, and that's exactly what they did. This wasn't the objective journalism we think of today. Oh, no. This was a bare-knuckle brawl fought with ink and paper. Newspapers like John Finau's Gazette of the United States became the mouthpiece for the Federalists, championing a strong central government, a robust financial system, and close ties with Britain. Finau painted Hamilton as a visionary architect of national prosperity. His pages were filled with essays, reports, and editorials that praised the administration's every move, framing their policies as the only path to stability and international respect. If you read the Gazette, you'd believe that anyone opposing Hamilton was a chaotic, dangerous radical, eager to drag America back into the anarchy of the pre-Constitution days. On the other side of the street, you had Philip Freneau's National Gazette. Backed by Jefferson and James Madison, this paper was the heart and soul of the Republican opposition. Freneau was a master of satire and a fiery writer. He depicted the Federalists not as nation-builders, but as would-be monarchs, secretly plotting to establish an American aristocracy. His paper decried Hamilton's financial plans as a scheme to enrich a wealthy elite at the expense of the common farmer and artisan. Through scathing poems, pointed essays, and reprinted letters from the countryside, the National Gazette championed states' rights, agrarian values, and the spirit of the French Revolution. Painting Jefferson as the true defender of liberty, suddenly, the streets of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston were flooded with these fiercely partisan papers. Newsboys on every corner weren't just selling news. They were selling a worldview. And people were buying in, literally and figuratively. These weren't just dry political treats. They were sensational, scandalous, and deeply personal. Think of it as the 18th century version of viral content. Rumors spread like wildfire. One day, a Federalist paper might print a story hinting at Jefferson's supposed atheism or his radical sympathies for the most extreme elements of the French Revolution. The next day, a Republican paper would retaliate with a vicious caricature of President Washington as a king, or accuse Hamilton of corruption and personal indiscretion. The attacks were relentless. They used pseudonyms to launch their most vicious assaults. Hamilton, writing as Catullus, would trade blows with Jefferson's allies. They dug into each other's pasts, questioned each other's patriotism, and twisted each other's words into unrecognizable shapes. The goal wasn't to inform. It was to persuade, to enrage, and to mobilize. They were creating political identities, forcing citizens to pick a team. And this battle of words spilled out of the coffeehouses and government halls and into every corner of American life. Families were divided over the dinner table. One brother, a merchant who benefited from Hamilton's economic policies, would argue fiercely with another, a farmer who felt crushed by federal taxes. Friendships that had been forged in the fires of the Revolution were strained, sometimes to the breaking point. Even the taverns, those quintessential public squares of early America, became ideological battlegrounds. A toast to President Washington might be met with cheers in one tavern and grumbles in another. depending on whether the patrons saw him as a unifying national hero or a pawn of the Federalist elite. The newspaper you read signaled your allegiance. It was a badge of identity. Clergymen used their pulpits to weigh in, quoting scripture to support either the Federalist cause of order and authority or the Republican cause of liberty and individual virtue. The very soul of the nation was up for grabs, and every citizen was being asked to choose a side. This was a terrifying development for the founding generation. They had designed a republic, a government based on reasoned debate and the common good. They feared faction, what we would call partisanship, believing it was a poison that could destroy everything they had built. George Washington himself warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party in his farewell address. He saw this division as a mortal threat to the young nation. Yet, in a way, this media war was also a sign of a vibrant, if chaotic, democracy in action. For the first time, political debate wasn't just for the wealthy and educated elite in Philadelphia. It was for everyone. A farmer in rural Virginia, a blacksmith in Massachusetts, a shopkeeper in Charleston, they were all being brought into the national conversation. They were reading, arguing, and forming opinions about the direction of their country. The literacy rate was surprisingly high, and for those who couldn't read, the papers were read aloud in taverns, workshops, and public squares. This explosion of political print democratized information and mobilized a national electorate in a way that had never been seen before. It was messy, it was ugly, and it was often based on lies and slander. But it was also the process by which Americans learned to be citizens of a divided republic. They were learning to disagree, fiercely and fundamentally, without resorting to violence. The Battle of the Newspapers defined the 1790s. It set the stage for the crucial election of 1800, one of the most bitter and contested in American history. The lines drawn by Fino and Freno, by Hamilton and Jefferson, would harden over time, shaping the American political landscape for decades to come. The country was divided, not by armies or oceans, but by ideas, spread on cheap paper and carried on the winds of political passion. The great American experiment in self-government had entered a new, uncertain, and incredibly noisy chapter. Thanks for watching. This period really shows how media has always played a powerful role in shaping our society, doesn't it? If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. We're diving deep into a truly turbulent time, the presidency of John Adams. So, picture this. It's 1797. George Washington has just stepped down, leaving some massive shoes to fill. The man chosen for the job, the brilliant, principled, and often cantankerous John Adams, a leading figure in the Federalist Party. Now, Adams didn't exactly inherit a peaceful nation. The world was on fire, specifically Europe. The French Revolution, which many Americans had initially cheered on, had taken a dark and bloody turn with the Reign of Terror. This put the young United States in an incredibly awkward position. On one side, you had Great Britain, our former colonial master but also a crucial trading partner. On the other, he had France, our key ally, during the Revolutionary War, but now a radical and unstable revolutionary government. The nation was deeply divided. The Democratic Republicans, led by Adams's own vice president, Thomas Jefferson, were largely They saw the French Revolution as a sister movement to our own fight for liberty. The Federalists, Adams's party, were more inclined to side with Britain. Fearing the chaos and radicalism spreading from France, America was caught in the middle, like a rope in a brutal tug-of-war between two European giants. This international crisis wasn't just happening over there. It was having real consequences at home. Both France and Britain began seizing American ships on the high seas. The French, feeling betrayed by an American treaty with Britain, were particularly aggressive. They captured hundreds of American vessels, costing merchants millions and threatening to cripple the nation's economy. The public was outraged. Cries of war! War with France echoed through the streets. This is where Adams's presidency really gets fascinating. He's under immense pressure. His own Federalist Party, led by the influential and ambitious Alexander Hamilton, was clamoring for war. They saw it as an opportunity to build up the military, crush the pro-French Democratic Republicans, and align the U.S. firmly with Britain. Hamilton, who had a complicated and often rivalrous relationship with Adams, was pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to steer the country towards a conflict he believed was necessary. But Adams, a man of deep principle, hesitated. He understood the patriotic anger, but he also knew that the fledgling United States was in no condition to fight a major war. The country was still young, its military was small, and its finances were fragile. A full-blown war with a European power like France could be disastrous, potentially undoing everything the Revolution had achieved. So, in a move that showed both his diplomatic skill and his stubborn independence, Adams decided to try for peace. In 1797, he sent 3 American envoys, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry to Paris to negotiate a settlement. He hoped to smooth things over, to find a diplomatic solution that would protect American shipping and avoid a catastrophic war. What happened next would become one of the most infamous episodes in American diplomatic history: the XYZ affair. When our diplomats arrived in Paris, they were met not by the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, but by 3 shadowy French agents. These agents, later referred to in official reports as X, Y, and Z, delivered a shocking ultimatum. Before any official negotiations could even begin, they demanded a massive bribe for Talleyrand and a huge loan for the French government. Essentially, they were telling the United States to pay up just for the privilege of being heard. The American envoys were stunned and insulted. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney's supposed response became legendary. No, not a sixpence. The diplomats refused the outrageous demands and sent a report back to President Adams, detailing the attempted extortion. When Adams made these dispatches public, replacing the French agents' names with X, Y, and Z, the American public exploded in fury. The attempt to bribe and bully the young nation was seen as a profound insult to American honor. The slogan "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute" became the rallying cry of the day. The war fever that had been simmering now boiled over. The XYZ affair completely discredited the pro-French faction and united the country, for a brief moment, against France. Now, with the nation baying for blood, Adams had the popular support to declare war. It would have been the easy political move, but again, he chose the harder path. While he recognized the need to prepare for a potential conflict, he still believed a full-scale declared war was not in the nation's best interest. Instead, he authorized what became known as the Quasi-War. This was an undeclared naval war, fought almost entirely at sea between 1798 and 1800. Adams pushed for the creation of the Department of the Navy and the construction of new warships. The brand new U.S. Navy, though small, performed surprisingly well, capturing dozens of French privateers and warships, primarily in the Caribbean. It was a period of intense naval action, a limited war designed to protect American interests without escalating into a total, nation-breaking conflict. However, the war fever at home had another, much darker consequence. Capitalizing on the anti-French sentiment, the Federalists in Congress passed a series of 4 laws in 1798, known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws were, to put it mildly, hugely controversial. The Alien Acts made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and gave the president the power to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous. This was largely aimed at French and Irish immigrants, who tended to support the Democratic Republic. Even more alarming was the Sedition Act. This law made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. In essence, it criminalized criticism of the president and the Federalist-controlled government. Under this act, several Democratic-Republican newspaper editors and even a member of Congress were arrested, tried, and jailed for speaking out against Adams and his policies. This was a direct assault on the principles of free speech and a free press, enshrined in the First Amendment. It was a moment of crisis for American liberty. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, were horrified. They argued that the Federalists were using the threat of war as an excuse to silence their political opponents and consolidate power, mimicking the very tyranny they had fought a revolution to escape. In response, Jefferson and Madison secretly drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. More radically, they introduced the concept of nullification, the idea that states had the right to nullify or declare void federal laws that they believed violated the Constitution. This planted a seed of states' rights theory that would have enormous consequences later in American history, particularly leading up to the Civil War. So here is John Adams, a man caught in a whirlwind. He's fighting an undeclared war at sea, battling his own party's hawkish wing led by Hamilton, and presiding over a country where fundamental liberties are being challenged by his own administration's laws. It's an incredibly complex and difficult position. Despite all the pressure for a Fusco war, Adams never gave up on peace, in a move that shocked and enraged many in his own party. He sent another peace mission to France in 1799. By this time, the political situation in France had changed. Napoleon Bonaparte was rising to power, and he was more interested in consolidating his control in Europe than in fighting a pointless war with the United States. This time, the negotiations were successful. In 1800, the two sides signed the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which officially ended the quasi-war. It terminated the old alliance from the Revolutionary War and established a new commercial relationship. John Adams had successfully navigated the nation through a perilous international crisis, and had avoided a devastating war. But his courage came at a great political cost. By choosing peace, he alienated the war-hungry Hamilton wing of the Federalist Party. This split the party right before the critical election of 1800. The Democratic Republic, meanwhile, had successfully used the unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts to paint the Federalists as tyrants. Adams, the man who steered the ship of state through the storm, found himself abandoned by his own crew and attacked by his opponents. In the election of 1800, Adams lost to his vice president and political rival, Thomas Jefferson. It was a bitter and hard-fought election, but it led to something remarkable. The first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in American history. Looking back, John Adams's presidency is often overlooked, sandwiched between the towering figures of Washington and Jefferson, but it was a crucial test for the young republic. Adams made decisions that were unpopular and politically costly, but which he believed were in the best long-term interest of the nation. He put country over party, and peace over popularity. He later wrote that he wished for his tombstone to read, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of the peace with France in the year 1800. It was, in his eyes, the most important and courageous act of his entire life." Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. It's a complex story, but a vital one for understanding the challenges our nation faced in its earliest years. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into American history. Today, we're stepping into a tumultuous period, the late 1790s, a time when the young United States was wrestling with its identity and its place in a world rocked by revolution. The year is 1798. President John Adams is in office, and the nation is teetering on the brink of war with France. This tense international climate, known as the Quasi-War, stirred up a storm of fear and suspicion back home. Inside the U.S., the political landscape was fiercely divided. On one side, you had the Federalists, led by figures like Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They championed a strong central government and were deeply wary of the radicalism of the French Revolution. They saw chaos and anarchy in France and feared that same spirit could infect America, especially through the influence of new immigrants. On the other side were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They were more sympathetic to France and staunch defenders of individual liberties and states' rights. They watched the Federalists' growing power with alarm, seeing it as a slide back towards the kind of monarchical tyranny they had just fought a revolution to escape. This clash of ideologies, supercharged by the threat of war, created a powder keg of political paranoia. The Federalists, holding the majority in Congress, became convinced that dissent was not just a difference of opinion, but an act of disloyalty. They believed that critics, particularly those in the vibrant and often scathing Republican press, were actively undermining the government and siding with a foreign enemy. They saw foreign-born residents, especially those from France and Ireland who tended to support the Republicans, as a potential fifth column, ready to stir up rebellion from within. It was in this climate of intense fear of foreign spies, fear of domestic insurrection, and fear of losing political control that the Federalists decided to take drastic action. In the summer of 1798, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed a series of 4 controversial laws that would become collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These weren't just ordinary pieces of legislation. They were weapons forged in the fires of political conflict, designed to silence opposition and consolidate Federalist power. Let's break them down. First came the Naturalization Act. This law extended the residency requirement for immigrants to become citizens from 5 years to a staggering 14 years. The motive was clear. Most new immigrants were aligning with the Democratic Republic. By delaying their citizenship, the Federalists could delay their right to vote, effectively stemming the tide of new Republican voters. It was a calculated political move, aimed at preserving their own electoral advantage. Next were 2 alien acts: the Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Friends Act gave the president the power to deport any non-citizen or alien deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. Without a trial or any real due process, think about that for a moment, the president could simply decide someone was a threat and have them removed from the country. The Alien Enemies Act allowed the president, during a declared war, to apprehend, restrain, and deport any male citizens of a hostile nation. While the Enemies Act was a wartime measure, the Friends Act was applicable even in peacetime, granting the executive branch an unprecedented and alarming level of power over the lives of non-citizens. But the most infamous of the 4 was the Sedition Act. This law made it a federal crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, Congress, or the president. It also criminalized conspiring to oppose any measure or measures of the government. On the surface, the Federalists argued it was necessary to protect the government from slander and prevent insurrection. They claimed it was a matter of national security, essential for maintaining order during a time of crisis. But the reality of its enforcement told a very different story. The Sedition Act was used almost exclusively to target Democratic Republican newspaper editors, printers, and politicians. It became a tool to crush political dissent. For example, Matthew Lyon, a Republican congressman from Vermont, was famously imprisoned for criticizing President Adams in a letter published in a newspaper. Another prominent victim was James Callender, a journalist who was fined and jailed for his writings against the Adams administration. In total, about 25 people were arrested under the Sedition Act, and 10 were convicted, all of them critics of the Federalist government. It was a direct assault on the principles of free speech and a free press, concepts that were supposed to be cornerstones of the new republic. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, watching in horror, saw the Alien and Sedition Acts as a gross overreach of federal power and a direct violation of the Constitution, particularly the First Amendment. They believed the Federalists were resurrecting the very tyranny they had fought to overthrow. But how could they fight back? The Federalists controlled Congress, the presidency, and the federal courts, which were upholding the Act's constitutionality. So, Jefferson and Madison took their fight to the states. In secret, they drafted a powerful set of arguments against the Acts, which came to be known as the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. Jefferson anonymously wrote the Kentucky Resolutions, and Madison the Virginia Resolutions. These documents laid out a bold theory of states' rights. They argued that the United States was a compact among the states, and that the states had their attend the duty to judge the constitutionality of federal laws. The Kentucky Resolutions even went a step further, introducing the controversial idea of nullification, the theory that a state could nullify or declare void a federal law it deemed unconstitutional within its borders. While no other states formally endorsed the resolutions, they served as a powerful rallying cry for the Democratic. They electrified the political debate and framed the upcoming presidential election of 1800 as a battle for the very soul of the nation. Was America going to be a nation where the central government could silence its critics and suppress dissent? Or would it be a republic that cherished liberty and open debate? The public outrage fueled by the Alien and Sedition Acts galvanized support for Jefferson and his party. The very laws intended to secure Federalist power ended up contributing significantly to their downfall. The Alien and Sedition Acts had a short and stormy life. The Alien Acts were largely unused and expired on their own. The Sedition Act expired on March 3, 1801, the day before Jefferson's inauguration, a final, pointed maneuver by the Federalists to ensure it couldn't be used against them. On saying no fees, President Jefferson pardoned everyone who had been convicted under the Sedition Act, seeing them as victims of political persecution. So, what is the legacy of this controversial chapter in American history? The Alien and Sedition Acts stand as a stark warning about the dangers of sacrificing civil liberties in the name of national security. They demonstrate how fear can lead a government to suppress the very freedoms it is meant to protect. The crisis forced a national conversation about the limits of federal power, the rights of states, and the fundamental importance of free speech and a free press. The arguments forged by Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions would echo through American history, influencing debates about states' rights for generations to come, all the way up to the Civil War and beyond. It was a defining moment that tested the resilience of American democracy and ultimately, through the public's rejection of these acts in the election of 1800, reaffirmed the nation's commitment to liberty. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to the 1790s. It's a complex and fascinating story that still resonates today. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you next time. Have you ever wondered what it takes to change the world without firing a single shot? It sounds like the start of a movie, but it really happened right here in America over 220 years ago. It's a story of bitter rivals, a deadlocked election, and a moment that would define the very soul of a new nation. This is the story of Thomas Jefferson's Revolution of 1800. Let's set the stage. The year is 1800. The United States is barely a decade old, and it's already on the brink of tearing itself apart. The two towering figures of the time, President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson, were once close friends, comrades in the fight for independence. Now, they were the leaders of two fiercely opposed political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republic. The Federalists, led by Adams and Alexander Hamilton, believed in a strong central government, a robust national bank, and friendly relations with Great Britain. They saw themselves as the guardians of order and stability, fearing that too much democracy could lead to chaos, much like the bloody French Revolution that was raging across the Atlantic. On the other side were Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans. They championed states' rights, an agrarian society of independent farmers, and were sympathetic to the ideals of the French Revolution. They feared that the Federalists were creating a powerful, overbearing government that was starting to look a lot like the British monarchy they had just fought to escape. The tension was palpable. The late 1790s had been a rough ride. The Federalists had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the government. It was a direct assault on free speech, and many journalists and even a congressman were jailed. To Jefferson and his supporters, this was proof that the Federalists were turning into tyrants. The nation was a powder keg, and the election of 1800 was the spark. The campaign itself was one of the nastiest in American history. There were no polite debates or TV ads. Instead, there were partisan newspapers slinging mud, printing scandalous rumors and vicious personal attacks. The Federalists painted Jefferson as a godless radical, a dangerous atheist who would import the chaos of the French Revolution to American shores. They claimed he'd burn Bibles and destroy the family. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans portrayed President Adams as a monarchist, a wannabe king who was squandering public money on lavish ceremonies and plotting to make his son the next president. It was brutal personnel, and it divided neighbors, friends, and families. Everyone believed the very future of the Republic was at stake. When the votes were finally cast, the results were a mess. It was clear the Federalists had lost, and John Adams was out. But who had won? The system back then was different. Electors cast 2 votes for president, and the person with the most votes became president, while the runner-up became vice president. Jefferson's party had a plan: All their electors would cast one vote for Thomas Jefferson, and all but one would cast their second vote for his running mate, Aaron Burr. This would make Jefferson president and Burr vice president, but something went wrong. A communication error? A slip-up? We don't know for sure. But every single Democratic-Republican elector cast their 2 votes for both Jefferson and Burr. The result? A perfect tie. 73 votes for Jefferson and 73 votes for Burr. According to the Constitution, a tie had to be broken by the House of Representatives. This is where things got really dangerous. The House that would decide the election was the old, outgoing House, which was still controlled by the defeated Federalists. They hated Jefferson. They saw him as their mortal enemy. But they didn't really trust Aaron Burr either. Burr was a notoriously ambitious and slippery political operator from New York. Suddenly, the Federalists had a choice. Pick the man whose principles they despised, or pick the man who had no principles at all. What followed was weeks of political chaos and backroom dealing. The House was deadlocked for 35 consecutive ballots. From February 11th to February 17th, 1801, they voted, and every single time, it was a tie. The country held its breath. Governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania began preparing their state militias, fearing the Federalists might try to steal the election and install a puppet president. There were real, credible fears of a civil war. The grand American experiment seemed to be on the verge of a violent collapse. In this moment of crisis, one man stepped in from the shadows: Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, the arch-Federalist, despised Jefferson's politics more than almost anyone. They had clashed 4 years over the direction of the country, but Hamilton knew both men well, and he feared Aaron Burr far more. He saw Burr as an unprincipled opportunist, a man who would burn the country down just to rule over the ashes. Jefferson, for all his radical ideas, at least had a vision for the country, a set of beliefs. Hamilton famously wrote that Jefferson was by far not so dangerous a man. Hamilton began lobbying his fellow Federalists, urging them to break the deadlock in favor of Jefferson. He argued that it was better to have an opponent with principles than a leader with none. Finally, on the 36th ballot, a few Federalists, persuaded by Hamilton's logic, decided to cast blank ballots instead of voting for Burr. This broke the tie, and Thomas Jefferson was officially elected the 3rd President of the United States. Imagine the tension in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1801. John Adams. The defeated president was so embittered that he slipped out of the city in the pre-dawn darkness, refusing to attend the ceremony. Power was passing from one party to its sworn enemy. In any other country at that time, this would have been a moment for coups, for riots, for armies in the streets. But instead, Thomas Jefferson simply walked from his boarding house to the new Capitol building and took the oath of office. And in his inaugural address, he delivered one of the most important speeches in American history. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten his defeated enemies. Instead, he sought to heal the nation's wounds. He reached out to the Federalists, famously declaring, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He reminded everyone that every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. He was saying that despite their bitter political fights, they were all Americans, bound together by a shared commitment to the Republic. And then, power transferred. Just like that. No violence, no rebellion, no civil war. For the first time in modern history, a government had been peacefully handed over from one ruling party to an opposition party based purely on the results of an election. This is why Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800. It was not a revolution of muskets and cannons, but a revolution of principles. It proved that the constitutional system the founders had designed actually worked. It established the precedent that political power in a democracy comes from the ballot box, not the battlefield. It affirmed that the voice of the people was the ultimate authority, and that even the bitterest of political foes could accept defeat and allow for a peaceful transition. This moment set the standard for American democracy. It was a radical idea then, and in many ways, it still is today. It is a testament to the idea that a nation can be built not on shared blood or a single ideology, but on a shared commitment to a process of debate, disagreement, and ultimately the peaceful acceptance of the people's will. The Revolution of 1800 wasn't just about Jefferson's victory. It was a victory for the idea of America itself. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments, what do you think, was it truly a revolution? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next video. Have you ever wondered what happens to a political party when it loses its way? When its core beliefs just don't resonate with the people anymore? That's exactly what happened to the Federalists, one of America's first major political parties. After John Adams's presidency, they found themselves on the outside looking in. And their decline was a fascinating, and in some ways, a cautionary tale. So, picture this. It's the early 1800s. America is expanding. A new generation is coming of age. And the democratic spirit is soaring. The Jeffersonian Republicans, with their faith in the common person and agrarian ideals, have captured the nation's heart. Meanwhile, the Federalists, the party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, are stuck in the past. Their whole philosophy was built on a certain kind of elite. They believed that the country should be run by the best people, the wealthy, the educated, the well-born. They were skeptical of too much democracy, fearing it would lead to chaos. Kayed mob rule. This distrust of the common voter was their Achilles heel. As more and more states began to drop property ownership requirements for voting, the electorate swelled with farmers, artisans, and frontiersmen. These were people who didn't see themselves as part of an elite class. They saw the Federalists as a group of out-of-touch aristocrats who looked down on them. The Federalists' message just didn't connect. It was like they were speaking a different language. While Jefferson was celebrating the yeoman farmer, the Federalists were grumbling about the dangers of popular opinion. Their political miscalculations didn't help either. A prime example is the Hartford Convention of 1814. During the War of 1812, a war they had fiercely opposed, a group of New England Federalists met in secret. They were frustrated with the war's impact on their region's economy and felt their influence in the national government was shrinking. They proposed some constitutional amendments to protect their interests, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Just as their complaints were made public, news arrived of Andrew Jackson's stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans and the signing of a peace treaty. Suddenly, the war that had been so unpopular was a source of immense national pride. The Federalists, who had been complaining and even hinting at secession, looked unpatriotic, even treasonous. It was a PR disaster from which they would never recover. They were branded as a party of complainers and disloyal dissenters. This was the final nail in the coffin for their national reputation. After the Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party's decline accelerated rapidly. They couldn't field a presidential candidate in 1820. James Monroe ran for re-election virtually unopposed, ushering in the so-called era of good feelings. It was less about good feelings and more about the complete and total collapse of one of the two major parties. By the 1820s, the Federalist Party as a national force was effectively extinct. It just faded away, with its members either retiring from public life or being absorbed into other political factions. So, does that mean they were a complete failure? Not at all. This is the crucial part of their story. While the party itself disappeared, its legacy is woven into the very fabric of the United States. Think about it. The Federalists, especially under Alexander Hamilton, created the nation's financial system. They established a national bank, funded the national debt, and promoted trade and manufacturing. These actions laid the groundwork for America to become an economic powerhouse. They weren't just building a government. They were building an economy. And let's not forget their contribution to the Constitution and the power of the federal government. They championed a strong central government, one capable of enforcing laws, defending the nation, and ensuring stability. Chief Justice John Marshall, a staunch Federalist, continued to advance these principles from the Supreme Court long after the party was gone. His landmark decisions, like Marbury v. Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland, established the principles of judicial review and federal supremacy, fundamentally shaping the balance of power in America. So, the Federalists lost the political battles of their day, but in many ways, they won the long-term war over America's structure. Their belief in a strong, centralized, and financially stable nation endured. The very institutions they built became the bedrock of a prosperous and powerful United States. Their ideas were absorbed into the mainstream, becoming so fundamental that we often take them for granted. The decline of the Federalists is a powerful lesson. It shows that in a democracy, you can't be afraid of the people. You have to adapt, you have to evolve, and your message has to resonate with the times. The Federalists failed to do that, but it also shows that a party's legacy isn't just about winning elections. It's about the lasting ideas and institutions they leave behind. The Federalist Party may be long gone, but their vision of a strong, unified, and economically vibrant America is still with us today, a silent but powerful testament to their enduring influence. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through American history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. We'd love to have you as part of our community. See you in the next chapter. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American story. Today, we're stepping into a fascinating, yet deceptively named period, the era of good feelings. Now, you might be thinking, good feelings? Finally, peace, unity, everyone holding hands and singing patriotic songs. Well, not quite, but let's set the stage. We're in the years following the War of 1812. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and even flirted with secession at the Hartford Convention, has basically imploded. They've lost all political credibility. This leaves one party standing tall, the Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson, and now, President James Monroe, with no real political opposition. The intense, bitter party rivalries that had defined the nation's early years seemed to vanish. It was a time of apparent national unity and purpose, which is what earned it the name the era of good feelings. And on the surface, things looked pretty rosy. The nation was expanding. A wave of patriotism swept the country after holding its own against the British Empire for a second time. American industry, which got a kickstart when British imports were cut off during the war, was beginning to grow. There was a sense of shared national identity that hadn't really existed before. People started thinking of themselves less as Virginians or New Yorkers, and more as Americans. This newfound nationalism manifested in policy. Leaders like Henry Clay advocated for what they called the American System, a plan to unify the country's economy with a national bank, protective tariffs for northern industries, and federal funding for infrastructure projects like roads and canals. The idea was to create a self-sufficient, interconnected nation, no longer so dependent on Europe. President Monroe himself embarked on goodwill tours across the country, even through former Federalist strongholds in New England. He was met with cheering crowds and grand celebrations. A Boston newspaper was the first to coin the phrase, "era of good feelings," to describe the warm reception he received. It really seemed like the partisan battles of the past were over and a new, harmonious chapter had begun. But, as is so often the case in history, the calm surface hid turbulent under. This era wasn't about the absence of problems. It was more like the problems were just simmering, waiting for the right moment to boil over. The good feelings were, in many ways, a temporary illusion. So, what were these simmering issues? Let's start with the economy. The burst of post-war prosperity didn't last. In 1819, a major financial crisis hit, known as the Panic of 1819. Speculation in Western lands, fueled by easy credit from banks, created a bubble. When the bubble burst, banks failed. Unemployment soared, and people fell into debt. This was the nation's first major economic depression, and it shattered the illusion of universal prosperity. The panic created deep resentment, particularly in the West and South, towards the Second Bank of the United States, which many blamed for tightening credit and making the crisis worse. This wasn't exactly a recipe for good feelings. It exposed the growing economic divisions between different regions of the country: the industrializing North, the agricultural South, and the developing West. Each region had different economic interests and different ideas about what the federal government should be doing. And then there was the elephant in the room, the issue that would ultimately tear the nation apart: slavery. As the country expanded westward, the question of whether new territories should be admitted to the Union as free states or slave states became the single most explosive issue in American politics. This issue came to a head in 1819, the same year as the financial panic, when Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. At the time, the number of free states and slave states was perfectly balanced at 11 each, admitting Missouri would tip that balance in the Senate in favor of the South. Northerners were horrified at the prospect of slavery expanding. An amendment was proposed in Congress to ban slavery in Missouri, which in turn enraged Southerners, who saw it as an attack on their property rights and their entire way of life. The debate was vicious. Thomas Jefferson, watching from his retirement at Monte, famously described the controversy as a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. He saw it as the knell of the Union, the death bell. He knew this wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a fundamental moral and economic conflict that threatened the very existence of the nation. The good feelings had officially ended. The crisis was narrowly averted by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It was a masterful, if temporary, piece of political maneuvering. Here's how it worked. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, but to maintain the balance, Maine was admitted as a free state. More importantly, the compromise drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase territory at the 3630 parallel. With the exception of Missouri itself, slavery was to be forever prohibited in all territories north of that line. This compromise saved the Union, for now. It kicked the can down the road, but it also clearly demarcated the country into two distinct sections. Free and slave. It institutionalized the sectional divide. So, the era of good feelings was incredibly brief, and, in hindsight, deeply ironic. It was a moment of one-party rule that masked the emergence of deeper, more dangerous conflicts. The old party system of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans was dead, but a new political landscape was forming, one based on sectional loyalties. The debates over the national bank, tariffs, internal improvements, and especially the expansion of slavery, were not resolved. They were simply postponed. These issues would fracture the Democratic-Republican Party itself, leading to the rise of new political factions and a new, even more contentious era of politics. The era highlights a crucial lesson. National unity is fragile. The apparent harmony of the post-war years was a thin veneer over profound disagreements about the nation's future. Was America going to be a nation of small farmers, as Jefferson had envisioned, or an industrial powerhouse, as Hamilton had hoped? And the most critical question of all, could a nation founded on the principle of liberty continue to exist half slave and half free? The era of good feelings provided no answers. Instead, it was the calm before a very, very long storm. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of a complex and pivotal time in American history. It just goes to show that names can be deceiving. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more dives into the past. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on the Missouri Compromise or the era of good feelings. See you in the next chapter. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a story that, on the surface, seems like ancient history. We're talking about America's first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republic. You might be thinking, who? Aren't they long gone? And you'd be right. These parties haven't existed for almost 200 years. But here's the fascinating part. Even though the names have changed, the fundamental fight they started is still the defining feature of American politics today. It's a battle of ideas that never ended. A ghost that haunts the halls of Congress and shapes every single election. So, who were these guys? On one side, you had the Federalists, led by the brilliant and ambitious Alexander Hamilton. They believed in a strong, centralized federal government. Hamilton envisioned an America that was a powerhouse of industry and commerce, respected on the world stage. To achieve this, he argued, the government needed the power to build infrastructure, manage a national economy, and maintain a robust military. The Federalists championed order, stability, and a government capable of acting decisively for the national good. They looked at the chaos of the post-revolutionary years and said, we need a firm hand on the tiller to steer this ship. On the other side stood the Democratic Republicans, with the intellectual giant Thomas Jefferson as their champion. Jefferson had a completely different vision for America. He dreamed of a nation of independent, small-scale farmers, an agrarian republic. He deeply distrusted concentrated power, whether it was in the hands of a king or a powerful central government. For Jefferson and his followers, the greatest threat to freedom was a government that became too big, too intrusive, and too distant from the people. They championed liberty, individual rights, and a government that was strictly limited by the Constitution. They believed that power should remain as close to the people as possible, at the state and local levels. So you have this fundamental clash right at the birth of the nation. Hamilton's Federalists. We need a strong government to create a great nation. Jefferson's Democratic. We need a limited government to protect our liberty. It was a battle between order and liberty, national power versus individual freedom. This wasn't just some polite disagreement over policy. It was a deep philosophical conflict about the very soul of the new republic. What kind of country was America going to be? The arguments were fierce, the personal attacks were brutal, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Now, let's fast forward through history. The Federalist Party eventually faded away, and the Democratic Republicans transformed into the modern Democratic Party. New parties, like the Whigs, and eventually the Republicans emerged. The names on the banners changed, but the core debate, it never went away. It simply put on new clothes. Think about the biggest conflicts in American history, the lead up to the Civil War. For instance, it was, at its heart, a debate over federal power versus states' rights, a direct echo of the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian worldviews. One side argued for the federal government's authority to abolish slavery and preserve the Union, while the other side fiercely defended the rights of states to determine their own laws and institutions. The same dynamic powered the major debates of the 20th century. Look at Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression. This was a massive expansion of federal power, a truly Hamiltonian moment. The government stepped in to regulate the economy, create social safety nets like Social Security, and build huge infrastructure projects. Supporters saw it as the government taking necessary action to restore order and save the nation from collapse. But critics, they sounded a lot like Jefferson. They warned of a dangerous overreach of government power, a threat to individual liberty and free enterprise. They argued that the federal government was getting too big and too powerful. The same pattern repeats itself over and over. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs in the 1960s, which included Medicare and Medicaid, were another surge of federal action to address social problems. This was met with a powerful conservative backlash, epitomized by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Reagan's famous line, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is a problem," is pure, uncut Jeffersonian philosophy. His entire platform was about shrinking the federal government, cutting taxes, and reducing regulation to unleash individual liberty and economic freedom. It was a direct counterargument to the decades of growing federal power. And that brings us to today. Listen to any political debate happening right now, whether it's on cable news, in Congress, or on social media. What are we arguing about? Healthcare? Should the government provide universal coverage, or should it be left to the private market? Climate change. Should the federal government impose sweeping regulations to combat it, or should we trust individual and corporate innovation? The economy. Should the government intervene to manage inflation and unemployment, or should it step back and let the free market work? Every single one of these issues is a modern-day replay of the Hamilton versus Jefferson debate. One side calls for bold, decisive action from a strong central government to solve national problems and ensure order. They are the heirs of Hamilton. The other side warns against government overreach, champions individual freedom, and advocates for limited government and local control. They are the children of Jefferson. The party labels may be Republican and Democrat now, but the philosophical DNA is unmistakable. This enduring conflict is the central tension of the American experiment. We've spent over 2 centuries trying to find the right balance between the two poles. How much power should the government have to ensure safety, stability, and equality? And at what point does that power begin to infringe upon the personal and economic liberties that define us? There is no easy answer, and maybe there isn't supposed to be one. Perhaps this constant push and pull, this never-ending debate between the visions of Hamilton and Jefferson, is the very engine that drives our democracy forward. It forces every generation to re-examine what it means to be American and to renegotiate the delicate balance between order and liberty. So the next time you're watching the news and you hear politicians arguing, remember that you're not just listening to a modern debate, You're hearing the echoes of a conversation that started over 200 years ago, a fundamental disagreement between two founding fathers that has defined and continues to define the United States of America. The names and faces have changed, but the great American argument rages on. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the ideas that shape our world. Drop a comment below and let me know, do you see this Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian split in our politics today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we are rediving deep into one of the most fascinating and consequential rivalries of all time, the clash between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. These two titans, these founding fathers, had vastly different visions for the future of the United States, and understanding their conflict is key to understanding the America we live in today. So, who were these men? On one side, you have Alexander Hamilton, an immigrant from the Caribbean, a self-made man who rose from poverty to become George Washington's right-hand man. Hamilton was a pragmatist, a realist. He believed in a strong, centralized federal government. He envisioned an America that was an industrial and commercial powerhouse, a nation that could compete on the world stage with the great empires of Europe. To achieve this, he proposed a national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, and protective tariffs to encourage domestic manufacturing. In his view, a robust national economy was the bedrock of national strength and stability. He trusted the elite, the wealthy, and the well-educated to steer the ship of state, fearing that too much power in the hands of the common people could lead to chaos and mob rule. On the other side, you have Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia planter, an aristocrat by birth, but a champion of the common man by conviction. Jefferson was an idealist, a romantic. He dreamed of an agrarian republic, a nation of independent, small-scale farmers. He believed that agriculture was the most virtuous and noble profession, and that the true strength of America lay in its self-sufficient citizens, tilling their own land. He deeply distrusted centralized power, seeing it as a threat to individual liberty. He feared that a powerful federal government, a national bank, and a focus on industry would create a dependent working class and a new form of aristocracy, mirroring the very European corruption they had fought a revolution to escape. For Jefferson, the soul of America was its people and their freedom. The conflict between these two worldviews was immediate and intense. It wasn't just a polite disagreement, it was a battle for the soul of the new nation. When Hamilton proposed his financial plan, Jefferson and his allies, like James Madison, were horrified. They saw it as a scheme to enrich speculators and consolidate power in the hands of a federal elite at the expense of the southern states and the ordinary farmer. They argued it was unconstitutional, that the federal government had no explicit power to create a national bank. Hamilton, in response, articulated the doctrine of implied powers. He argued that the Constitution wasn't just a list of what the government could do, but a framework. If a measure was necessary and proper to carry out the government's enumerated powers like collecting taxes and regulating commerce, then it was constitutional. This argument was revolutionary, and it set a precedent for a flexible, evolving interpretation of the Constitution that has shaped American law ever since. The debate raged in newspapers, in pamphlets, and in the halls of Congress. It was fierce, personal, and it gave birth to America's first political parties, the Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. This wasn't something the founders had originally intended. In fact, many, like Washington, warned against the dangers of factions and political parties. But the ideological chasm between Hamilton and Jefferson was so profound that it naturally pulled people to one side or the other. It was a division between urban and rural, north and south, industry and agriculture, federal power and states' rights. Think about the famous dinner table bargain of 1790. Hamilton's financial plan was stalled in Congress, and the location of the nation's permanent capital was also a point of heated contention. According to Jefferson's account, he brokered a deal. He would persuade his Southern allies to support Hamilton's plan for the federal government to assume state debts. In exchange, Hamilton would use his influence to ensure the new capital city would be located on the Potomac River, a location favorable to the South. This compromise was a masterstroke of political negotiation. It saved Hamilton's financial system, which arguably saved the nation from bankruptcy, and it created the capital we know today. Washington, D.C. It shows that even in their deepest disagreements, they could find a way to move the country forward. As the years went on, their philosophies continued to clash. During the French Revolution, Jefferson and his followers were staunch supporters of the revolutionaries, seeing it as a continuation of America's own fight for liberty. Hamilton and the Federalists, however, were appalled by the violence and chaos, and they favored closer ties with Britain for the sake of economic stability. This difference in foreign policy was not just academic, it had real-world consequences, nearly dragging the young nation into a European war. So, who was right? Hamilton, with his vision of a powerful, industrial nation, or Jefferson, with his dream of an agrarian republic of free individuals? The fascinating thing, when you look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, is that both men were right, and both were wrong. Hamilton's vision, in many ways, won the economic argument. His financial architecture laid the foundation for the United States to become the world's greatest economic superpower. The dynamic, capitalist, and industrial nation we are today owes a tremendous debt to his foresight. But he was wrong to distrust the common people. His elitism and his fear of democracy were out of step with the nation's evolving spirit. Jefferson, on the other hand, perfectly captured that spirit. His faith in the people, his eloquent defense of liberty, and his insistence on limiting government power have resonated through generations of Americans. The Declaration of Independence, his masterpiece, is the nation's creed. The idea that all men are created equal is the moral compass that has guided America, however imperfectly, toward a more inclusive and just society. But his agrarian ideal was ultimately a romantic fantasy. It couldn't have sustained a growing population or competed in a rapidly industrializing world. A nation of only farmers would have been left behind, vulnerable and poor. So, what is the ultimate lesson from the epic struggle between Hamilton and Jefferson? It's perhaps the most important lesson in a democracy. They taught America that disagreement is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of health. That debate, even fierce and passionate debate, is not danger, it is the very engine of democracy. Hamilton's strength built the nation's economic skeleton. Jefferson's faith in the people gave it a soul. One gave us the means to prosper. The other gave us the reason to. Their rivalry created a dynamic tension that continues to define American politics to this day. The ongoing debate between a strong central government and states' rights, between industrial interests and individual liberties, between security and freedom, it's all an echo of Hamilton and Jefferson. They showed us that a nation can be forged not in the fire of unanimity, but in the crucible of argument. They proved that a republic can contain opposing views, and in fact, can be strengthened by them. The balance between their two powerful visions is what has allowed America to adapt, to grow, and to endure. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into American history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Are you more of a Hamiltonian or a Jeffersonian? Let's keep the conversation going. Until next time. 0 o'clock to 1 o'clock. Hello and welcome back. We've journeyed through the turbulent birth of American politics, witnessing the fierce debates and personal clashes that defined a new nation. We've seen how two towering figures, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, with their vastly different visions for the country's future, laid the groundwork for the political system we know today. Their disagreements weren't just petty squabbles. They were foundational arguments about the very soul of America. Should it be an agrarian society of independent farmers, as Jefferson envisioned, or a bustling hub of commerce and industry, as Hamilton championed? These weren't easy questions, and they sparked a rivalry that echoed from the halls of government to the pages of newspapers, dividing friends, families, and a fledgling nation. 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, this era, often called the first-party system, was a crucible. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, advocated for a strong central government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. They believed that this was the only way to ensure stability and economic growth. On the other side were the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson's party, who championed states' rights, feared the concentration of power, and sympathized with revolutionary France. They saw themselves as the true guardians of the liberty won in the revolution. The tension was palpable. The political discourse was often harsh, personal, and filled with accusations that would make even today's pundits blush. It was a time of great uncertainty, where it seemed the grand American experiment could shatter at any moment. 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Think about the election of 1800. It's often called the Revolution of 1800. And for good reason. It was the first time in modern history that power was peacefully transferred from one political party to another. After a bitter and contentious campaign, Thomas Jefferson defeated the incumbent John Adams. For a moment, the world held its breath. Would the Federalists relinquish power? Would the new nation descend into civil war? But it didn't. The transfer happened. It was a messy, imperfect, and incredibly significant moment. It proved that the system, this new form of government, could work. It demonstrated that a nation could change its leadership not through bullets, but through ballots. 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, this transition from rivalry to a functioning, albeit noisy, democracy wasn't a foregone conclusion. It was the result of a profound, unspoken agreement among these early leaders. Despite their deep-seated differences, they shared a common, overriding commitment: the preservation of the republic. They understood that the nation was more important than any single man or party. This principle, the idea that the opposition is not the enemy but a legitimate part of the political landscape, is the bedrock of democratic governance. They were learning, in real time, how to disagree without destroying each other or the country they had fought so hard to create. 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Let's fast forward a bit. The Federalist Party eventually faded away, but its ideas didn't. They were absorbed and adapted by new political movements. The Democratic-Republican Party itself splintered, giving rise to the parties we see today. This evolution is key. The specific arguments change, the names of the parties change, but the fundamental tension between different visions for the country remains. This dynamic is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. It's the engine of progress, forcing compromise, encouraging debate, and ensuring that no single ideology can dominate unopposed. 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, the story of America's first political parties, therefore, is not just a historical account of division. It is a powerful lesson in the art of democratic living. It teaches us that a nation can learn to not just tolerate its internal differences, but to actually thrive because of them. The constant push and pull between competing ideas forges a stronger, more resilient society. It forces us to constantly re-examine our beliefs, to defend our positions, and to find common ground. This process can be frustrating, slow, and often infuriating, but it is also vital. 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, think of it like a conversation, a great national debate that has been going on for over 2 centuries. Every election, every piece of legislation, every protest, and every political argument is a new sentence in that ongoing conversation. Jefferson and Hamilton started it, but every generation of Americans has added its own voice, its own concerns, and its own hopes. We are all participants in this debate, whether we realize it or not. The freedom to voice our dissent, to argue for our vision of a better future, is the most precious inheritance they left us. Las 7, las 8. As we reach the end of our journey together, what's the ultimate takeaway? It's that democracy is not a quiet or tidy affair. It's loud, it's contentious, and it's always in motion. The rivalry between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans wasn't the beginning of the end for America. It was the beginning of its political life. It established a pattern of competitive politics that, while often stressful, is essential for a free society. It proved that a nation could be built not on perfect unity, but on a shared commitment to resolving its differences peacefully. 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. The story of America's first political parties is not just about division. It's about a nation learning to live with differences and to thrive because of them. Even in heated arguments, freedom finds its voice. And in every debate, the heart of democracy beats on. It's a rhythm of disagreement and consensus, of challenge and compromise. This rhythm is the sound of a free people governing themselves. It is a sound that began in the charged atmosphere of Philadelphia and continues to echo in our own lives today. 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a crucial chapter of history. I hope it's given you a new perspective on the political world we inhabit today. The challenges are different, but the fundamental principles remain the same. If you found this journey insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the stories that shape our world. Your support makes all of this possible. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.